Chapter 1. A radiant late afternoon. The sunshine almost as thick as syrup in the quiet streets of the left bank. And everything, the people's faces, the countless familiar sounds of the street, exuded a joy to be alive. There are days like this, when ordinary life seems heightened, when the people walking down the street, the trams and cars all seem to exist in a fairy tale. It was 27th of June. When Maigret arrived at the gate of the Santé prison, he found the guard gazing soppily at a little white cat that was playing with the dog from the dairy. Some days, the pavement must be more resonant underfoot. Maigret's footsteps echoed in the vast courtyard. He walked to the end of a corridor, where he asked a warder, "Does he know?" Not yet. A key turned in the lock. The bolt was pulled back. A high-ceilinged cell. Very clean. A man stood up, looking unsure as to which expression to adopt, and, "All right, Lenoir," the inspector asked. The man nearly smiled, but a thought came into his mind and his face hardened. He frowned suspiciously, and his mouth twisted into a sneer for a moment or two. Then he shrugged his shoulders and held out his hand. "I see," he said. "What do you see?" A resigned smile. "Give it a rest, eh? You must be here because—" "I'm here because I'm off on holiday tomorrow," and the prisoner gave a hollow laugh. He was a tall young man. His dark hair was brushed back. He had regular features, fine brown eyes. His thin, dark mustache set off the whiteness of his teeth, which were as sharp as a rodent's. That's very kind of you, Inspector." He stretched, yawned, put down the lid of the toilet in the corner of the cell, which had been left up, and, "Excuse the mess." Then suddenly, looking Maigret in the eye, he said, "They've turned down the appeal, haven't they?" There was no point in lying. He knew already. He started pacing up and down. "I knew they would. So when is it? Tomorrow." "Even so." His voice faltered, and his eyes drank in the glimmer of light from the narrow window high up the cell wall. At that moment, the evening papers being sold on the café terraces announced, "The President of the Republic has rejected the appeal of Jean Lenoir, the young leader of the Belleville gang. The execution will take place tomorrow at dawn." It was Maigret himself who had arrested Lenoir 3 months previously, in a hotel in Rue Saint-Antoine. A split second later, and the bullet the gangster fired at him would have caught him full in the chest rather than ending up lodged in the ceiling. In spite of this, the inspector bore him no grudge. Indeed, he had taken something of a shine to him. Firstly, perhaps, because Lenoir was so young, a 22-year-old who had been in and out of prison since the age of 15, but also because he had a self-confidence about him. He had had accomplices. 2 of them were arrested at the same time as him. They were both guilty, and on this occasion, an armed robbery. They probably played a bigger part than the boss himself. However, Lenoir got them off the hook. He took the whole blame on himself and refused to spill the beans. Oh, he never put on an act. Wasn't too full of himself. He didn't blame society for his actions. "Looks like I've lost," was all he said. It was all over. More precisely, it would be all over when the sun, which was casting a golden strip of light on the cell wall, next rose, almost unconsciously. Lenoir felt the back of his neck. He shivered, turned pale, gave a derisive laugh. "It feels weird." Then suddenly, in an outburst of bitterness, "There are others who deserve this, and I wish they were going down with me." He looked at Maigret, hesitated, walked round the narrow cell once more, muttering, "Don't get excited. I'm not going to put anyone in the frame now." But all the same, the inspector avoided looking at him. He could feel a confession coming, and he knew the man was so prickly that the slightest reaction or sign of interest on his part would make him clam up. There's a little place known as the Two-Penny Bar. I don't suppose you're familiar with it, but if you happen to find yourself in the neighborhood, you might be interested to know that one of the regulars there has more reason than me to be putting his head on the block tomorrow. He was still pacing up and down. He couldn't stay still. It was hypnotic. It was the only sign of his inner turmoil. But you won't get him. Look, without giving anything away, I can tell you this much. I don't know why this is coming back to me now. Maybe because I was just a kid. I couldn't have been more than 16. Me and my friend used to do a bit of filching around the dance halls. He must be in a sanatorium by now. He already had a cough back then. Was all this talk just to give himself the illusion of being alive? To prove to himself that he was still a man? One night, it must have been around 3 in the morning, we were walking down the street. It doesn't matter which street, just a street. We saw a door opening ahead of us. There was a car parked by the roadside. This guy came out, pushing another guy in front of him. No, not pushing. Imagine you're carrying a shop dummy and trying to make it look like it's your friend walking next to you. He put him in the car and got into the driver's seat. My friend shot me a look, and we both jumped up onto the rear bumper. In those days, they called me the Cat. That tells you all you need to know. The guy drove all over the place. He seemed to be looking for something, but seemed to keep losing his way. In the end, we realized what he'd been looking for, because we arrived at the Canal Saint Martin. You've worked it out, haven't you? It was over in the time it takes to open and shut a car door. One body at the bottom of the canal, smooth as you like. The guy in the car must have put lead weights in the stiff's pockets because he sank like a stone. We kept our cool. Another wink, and we're back on the bumper. Then it was just a case of checking the client's address. He stopped in the Place de la République to have a glass of rum at the only cafe that was open. Then he drove his car to the garage and went home. We could see his silhouette through the curtains as he got undressed. We blackmailed him for 2 years, Victor and me. We were novices. We were afraid of asking for too much, a few hundred at a time. Then one day he moved in house, and we lost him. Then 3 months ago, I ran into him again at the Two-Penny Bar. He didn't even recognize me. Lenoir spat on the ground, automatically searched his pockets for his cigarettes. You'd think they'd let me smoke in my situation, he muttered. The shaft of sunlight above their heads had disappeared. Footsteps could be heard out in the corridor. It's not that I'm making out that I'm better than I am, but this guy I'm telling you about should be up there with me tomorrow. Suddenly, the beads of sweat stood out on his forehead, and his legs buckled. He sat down on the edge of his bunk. "Leave me," he sighed. "No, don't leave me alone today. It's better to talk to someone. Hey, do you want me to tell you about Marcel, the woman who—" The door opened. The prisoner's lawyer hesitated when he saw Maigret. He had pasted on his professional smile so that his client wouldn't be able to guess that his appeal had been turned down. "I have good news," he began. I know. Then, to Maigret, guess I won't be seeing you. Inspector? Well, we've all got a job to do. By the way, I wouldn't bother checking out the two-penny bar. This guy is just as cunning as you. Maigret offered his hand. He saw his nostrils twitch, his dark mustache moisten with sweat, the two front teeth biting the lower lip. Better this than typhoid, Lenoir joked, with a forced laugh. Maigret didn't go away on holiday. There was a case involving forged bonds that took up nearly all of his time. He had never heard of the two-penny bar. He asked around among his colleagues. Don't know it. Whereabouts on the Marne, the lower Seine? Lenoir was 16 at the time of the events he had described, so the case was 6 years old. And one evening, Maigret read the reports for that year. There was nothing sensational. Missing persons, as always. A woman chopped up into pieces, whose head was never found. As for the Canal Saint-Martin, it had thrown up no less than 7 corpses. The forged bonds turned out to be a complicated case, involving many lines of inquiry. Then he had to drive Madame Maigret to her sister's in Alsace, where she stayed for a month every year. Paris was emptying. The asphalt grew sticky underfoot. Pedestrians sought the shady side of the street, and the cafe terraces were full, expecting you Sunday without fail. Love from everyone. Madame Maigret's summons arrived when her husband had failed to turn up for a fortnight. It was Saturday, 23 July. He tidied up his desk and warned Jean, the office boy at the Quai des Orfèvres, that he probably wouldn't be back before Monday evening. As he was about to leave, he noticed the brim of his bowler, which had been torn for weeks. His wife had told him a dozen times to buy a new one. You'll have people throwing you coins in the street. He spotted a hat shop in Boulevard Saint-Michel. He tried on a few, but they were all too small for his head. I'm sure this one will be just right, the spotty young shop assistant kept insisting. Maigret was never more miserable than when he was trying things on in shops. In the mirror, he was looking in. He spotted a man's back and head, and on the head, a top hat. As the man was dressed in hunting tweeds, he cut a rather droll figure. No, I wanted something a bit older looking, he was saying. It's not meant to be smart. Maigret was waiting for the assistant to return from the back of the shop with some new hats for him to try on. It's just for a little play acting, a mock marriage, which we're putting on with a few friends at the two-penny bar. There'll be a bride, mother of the bride, page boys, the lot, just like a village wedding. Now, do you see what I'm after? I'm playing the part of the village mayor. The customer gave a hearty laugh. He was about 35, thick-set, with rosy cheeks. He had the air of a prosperous businessman, maybe one with a flat brim. Hold on. I think we've got just the thing you're after in the workshop. It was a canceled order. Maigret was brought another pile of bowlers. The first one he tried on fitted, but he dallied and made sure he left the shop just before the man with the opera hat. He hailed a taxi, just in case he needed it. He did. The man came out of the shop, got into a car, parked next to the pavement, and drove off in the direction of Rue Vieille du Temple. There, he spent half an hour in a second-hand shop and emerged with a flat cardboard box, which obviously contained a suit to go with his top hat. Then on to the Champs-Élysées, Avenue de Wagram, a small bar on a street corner. He stayed there only 5 minutes and left accompanied by a buxom, jovial-looking woman who must have been in her 30s. Twice, Maigret looked at his watch. His first train had already gone. The second would be leaving in a quarter of an hour. He shrugged his shoulders and told the taxi driver, "Keep following him," much as he had expected. The car drew up in front of an apartment block on Avenue Neil. The couple hurried in through the entrance. Maigret waited a quarter of an hour, then went in, taking note of the brass plate. Bachelor apartments by the month or by the day. In a smart office, which had a whiff of adultery, he found a perfumed manageress. "Police. The couple who just came in here." Which couple? But she didn't put up much of a struggle. Very respectable people. Both married, they come twice a week. On his way out, the inspector glanced through the car windscreen at the identity plate. Marcel Basso, 32. Quai d'Austerlitz. Paris. Not a breath of wind. The air was warm and heavy. All the trams and buses heading for the railway stations were packed. Taxis full of deck chairs, fishing rods, shrimp nets, and suitcases. The asphalt glistened blue, and the cafe terraces resounded with the clatter of saucers and glasses. After all, 3 weeks ago, Lenoir was... There hadn't been much talk about it. It was an everyday case. He was what you might call a professional criminal. Maigret remembered the quivering mustache and sighed as he looked at his watch. Too late now. Madame Maigret would be waiting with her sister at the barrier of the little station that evening, and would not fail to mutter, "Always the same?" The taxi driver was reading a newspaper. The man with the top hat left first, scanned the street both ways before signaling to his companion, who was lurking in the entrance. They stopped in Place des Ternes. He saw them kiss through the rear windscreen. They were still holding hands after the woman had hailed a taxi and the man was ready to drive off. "Do you want me to follow?" the driver asked Maigret. Might as well. At least he'd found someone who knew the two-penny bar. Quai d'Austerlitz. Huge sign. Marcel Basso. Coal importer. Various sources. Wholesale and retail. Domestic deliveries by the sack. Special summer prices. A yard surrounded by a black fence. On the opposite side of the street, a quayside bearing the firm's name, with moored barges and a newly unloaded pile of coal. In the middle of the yard, a large house, in the style of a villa. Monsieur Basso parked his car, automatically brushed his shoulders to remove any female hairs, and went into his house. Maigret saw him reappear at the wide-open window of a room on the first floor. He was with a tall, attractive blonde woman. They were both laughing and talking in an excited fashion. Monsieur Basso was trying on his top hat and looking at himself in the mirror. They were packing suitcases. There was a maid in a white apron in the room. A quarter of an hour later, it was now 5 o'clock. The family came downstairs. A boy of about 10 led the way, brandishing an air rifle. Then came the servant, Madame Basso, her husband, a gardener carrying the cases. The group was brimming with good humor. Cars drove past, heading for the country. At Gare de Lyon, the specially extended holiday trains whistled shrilly. Madame Basso got in next to her husband. The boy climbed into the back seat among the cases and lowered the windows. The car was nothing fancy, just a standard family car, dark blue, nearly new. A few minutes later, they were driving towards Villeneuve-Saint-Georges. Then they took the road towards Corbeil. They drove through the town and ended up on a potholed road along the bank of the Seine, Mont-Loisir. That was the name of the villa, on the river between Morsang and Seine-Port. It looked newly built. Bricks still shiny. the paintwork fresh, flowers in the garden that looked as if they had been washed that morning, a diving board over the river, rowing boats by the bank. Oh, do you know the area? Maigret asked his driver. A bit. Is there somewhere to stay around here? In Morsang, the Vieux Garçon, or further on, at Senport, chez Marius, and the two-penny bar. The driver shrugged. The taxi was too conspicuous to stay there much longer by the roadside. The Bassos had unloaded their car. No more than 10 minutes had elapsed before Madame Bassot appeared in the garden, dressed in a sailor's outfit, with an American naval cap on her head. Her husband must have been more eager to try out his fancy dress, for he appeared at a window, buttoned up in an improbable-looking frock coat, with the top hat perched on his head. What do you reckon? Shouldn't you be wearing the sash? What sash? Mayors all wear a tricolor sash. Canoes glided slowly by on the river. In the distance, a tug blew its siren. The sun was sinking behind the trees on the hillside further downstream. Let's try the Vieux Garçon, said Maigret. The inn had a large terrace next to the Seine. Boats of all sorts were moored to the bank, while a dozen or so cars were parked behind the building. Do you want me to wait for you? I don't know yet. The first person he met was a woman dressed all in white, who almost ran into him. She was wearing orange blossom in her hair. She was being chased by a young man in a swimming costume. They were both laughing. Some other people were observing the scene from the front steps of the inn. Hey, keep your dirty paws off the bride, someone shouted, at least until after the wedding. The bride stopped, out of breath, and Maigret recognized the lady from Avenue Niel, the one who visited the apartment with Monsieur Bassot twice a week. A man in a green rowing boat was putting away his fishing tackle, his brow furrowed, as if he were performing some delicate and difficult operation. 5 Pernod, 5 po. A young man came out of the inn, his face plastered with grease paint and rouge. He was made up to look like a freckly, ruddy-cheeked peasant. What do you think? You should have red hair. A car arrived. Some people got out, already dressed up for the village wedding. There was a woman in a puce silk dress which trailed along the ground. Her husband had stuffed a cushion under his waistcoat to simulate a paunch and was wearing a boat chain that was meant to look like a watch chain. The sun's rays turned red. The leaves on the trees barely stirred. A canoe drifted downstream. Its passenger, stripped to the waist, sat at the back, doing no more than lazily steer it with a paddle. What time are the carriages due to arrive? Maigret hung around, feeling out of place. Have the Bassos arrived? They passed us on the way. Suddenly, someone came and stood in front of Maigret. A man of about 30, already nearly bald, his face made up like a clown's. He had a mischievous glint in his eyes. He spoke with a pronounced English accent. Here's someone to play the notary. He wasn't completely drunk. He wasn't completely sober, either. The rays of the setting sun turned his face purple. His eyes were bluer than the river. You'll be the notary, won't you? He asked, with the familiarity of a drunkard. Of course you will, old chap. We'll have a great time. He took Maigret's arm and added, Let's have a Pernod. Everyone laughed. A woman muttered, He's got a nerve. That James. But James wasn't bothered. He dragged Maigret back to the Vieux Garçon. 2 large Pernods. He was laughing at his own little joke as they were served 2 glasses full to the brim. Chapter 2. By the time they got to the two-penny bar, things hadn't yet clicked for Maigret, as he liked to say. He hadn't had any high hopes in following Monsieur Bassot. At the Vieux Garçon, he had looked on gloomily as the people milled about. But he hadn't felt that nibble, that little shift, the click that told him he was on to something. While James was forcing him to have a drink with him, he had seen customers come and go, helping each other to try on their ridiculous costumes, laughing, shouting. The Bassos had turned up, and their son, whom they had made up as a carrot-headed village idiot, had gone down a storm. "Don't mind them," said James each time Maigret turned round to look at the group. "They're having a good time, and they're not even drunk." 2 carriages had drawn up, more shouting, more laughing and jostling. Maigret sat next to James, while the landlord, his wife, and the staff of the Vieux Garçon lined up on the terrace to see them off. The sun had given way to a blue-tinted twilight. The lights from the windows of the quiet villas on the far bank of the Seine glimmered in the dusk. The carriages trundled onwards. The inspector took in the scene around him, the coachman, whom everyone teased and who responded with a laugh through gritted teeth. A young girl who had made herself up as the simple country lass, and who was trying to put on a peasant accent. A gray-haired man dressed like a granny. It was all very confusing. Such an unexpected mix of people that Maigret could scarcely work out who went with whom. He needed to get things in focus. "See her over there? That's my wife," James told him, pointing out the plumpest of the women, who was wearing leg-of-mutton sleeves. He said this in a cheerless tone, with a glint in his eyes. They sang, they passed through Seine-Port, and people came out onto their doorsteps to watch the procession go by. Little boys ran after the carriages for some distance, whooping with delight. The horses slowed to walking pace. They crossed a bridge. A sign could just about be made out in the half-light. Eugène Rougier, licensee, a tiny little whitewashed house squeezed in between the towpath and the hillside. The lettering on the sign was crude. As they approached, they could hear snatches of music, interspersed with a grinding noise. What was it that finally clicked? Maigret couldn't put his finger on it. Perhaps the mildness of the evening, the little white house with its 2 lighted windows, and the contrast with this invading circus troupe. Perhaps the couple who came forward to see the wedding party, the man a young factory worker, the woman in a pink silk dress, standing with her hands on her hips. The house had only 2 rooms. In the one on the right, an old woman was busy at her stove. In the one on the left could be seen a bed, some family portraits. The bistro was at the back. It was a large lean-to with one wall completely open to the garden. Tables and benches, a bar, a mechanical piano, and some Chinese lanterns. Some bargees were drinking at the bar. A girl of about 12 was keeping an eye on the piano, occasionally rewinding it and slipping 2 sous into the slot. The evening got going very quickly. No sooner had the new arrivals climbed down from the carriages than they cleared away the tables and started dancing, calling for drinks. Maigret had lost sight of James and found him again at the bar, lost in thought over a Pernod. The waiters were laying the tables outside under the trees. One of the carriage drivers moaned, "I hope they don't keep us too late. It's Saturday." Maigret was alone. Slowly, he turned full circle. He saw the little house with its plume of smoke, the carriages, the lean-to, the 2 young lovers, The crowd in fancy dress. This is it, he murmured to himself. The two-penny bar. The name might refer to the poverty of the establishment, or perhaps to the 2 coins you had to put into the mechanical piano to make it work. And somewhere here, there was a murderer. Perhaps one of the wedding party. Perhaps the young factory hand. Perhaps one of the bargees. Where was James? Where was Monsieur Basso? There was no electric lighting. The lean-to was lit by 2 oil lamps, and other lamps on the tables and in the garden. So the whole scene was a patchwork of light and dark. Come on, food's ready. But they carried on dancing. A few people must have been knocking back the aperitifs, for within a quarter of an hour there was a distinctly drunken atmosphere in the place. The old woman from the bistro waited at the tables herself, anxious that the food was going down well. Salami, then an omelet, then rabbit. But no one cared much. They hardly noticed what they were eating, and everyone wanted their glass refilled. A noisy hubbub, drowning out the music. The bargees at the bar watched the goings-on and carried on their meandering conversation about the canals of the north and electric haulage systems. The 2 lovers danced cheek to cheek, but they couldn't take their eyes away from the tables where all the merrymaking was going on. Maigret didn't know anyone. He was sitting next to a woman who had a ridiculous painted mustache and beauty spots dabbed all over her face, who for some reason kept calling him Uncle Arthur. Would you pass the salt, Uncle Arthur? Everyone was on first-name terms. There was much backslapping and ribbing going on. Was this a group of people who knew each other well, or just a crowd that had been thrown together by chance? And what did they do in real life? For example, the gray-haired man dressed as the granny, or the woman dressed up as a little girl, who spoke in a falsetto voice. Were they middle class, like the Basso? Marcel Basso was sitting next to the bride. They weren't flirting. Occasionally, they exchanged a meaningful glance that probably meant, "This afternoon was good, wasn't it?" Avenue Neil. In a furnished apartment. Was her husband here too? Someone let off a firecracker. A Bengal light was lit in the garden, and the young couple watched it tenderly, hand in hand. "It's just like in a theater," said the pretty girl in pink. And there was a murderer. Speech, speech, speech. Monsieur Basso got to his feet, a beaming smile on his face. He coughed, pretended to be embarrassed, and began an absurd speech that was interrupted by rounds of applause. Now and again, his eye fell on Maigret. His was the only serious face around the tables, and Maigret sensed the man's discomfort as he turned his head away. Nevertheless, his gaze returned to Maigret twice, 3 times more, questioning, troubled. "And I'm sure you'll join me in a toast to the bride." To the bride. Everyone stood up. People kissed the bride, clinked glasses. Maigret saw Monsieur Basso go over to James and ask him a question. No doubt it was, "Who's that?" He heard the reply, "I don't know. Just a pal. He's fine." The tables had been abandoned. Everyone was dancing in the lean-to. A small group of people, barely distinguishable from the tree trunks in the dark, had gathered to watch the fun. Corks were popping. "Nice ship shine. Come and have a brandy," said James. "I guess you aren't a dancer." What an odd fellow. He had already drunk enough to lay out 4 or 5 normal men. But he wasn't really drunk. He just slouched around, looking sour, not joining in. He took Maigret back into the house. He sat in the landlord's high-backed armchair. A stooping old woman was doing the washing up while the landlord's wife, who didn't look far off 50, and who was no doubt her daughter, busied herself around the kitchen. Eugène, another 6 bottles of bubbly. It might be a good idea to ask the coachman to go and fetch some more from Corbeil. A country cottage interior, very poor. A pendulum clock in a carved walnut case. James stretched out his legs, picked up the bottle of brandy he had ordered, and poured out 2 glasses. Cheers! The sound of the voices and the music were now a distant hubbub. Through the open door, they could see the fast-moving current of the Seine. Little cubbyholes for canoodling couples, said James contemptuously. He was 30 years old, but it was obvious he wasn't the canoodling type. I bet they're at it already at the bottom of the garden. He watched the old woman, bent double over her washing up. Here, give me a tea towel. He started drying the glasses and dishes, pausing only to take a swig of cognac. Now and again, someone passed by the door. Maigret took advantage of a moment when James was talking to the old woman to slip away. He'd only gone a few paces out of the door when someone asked him for a light. It was the gray-haired man in the woman's dress. Thanks. You don't dance either. Never. Not like my wife. Then she hasn't missed a single dance. The bride. Yes? And when she does stop, she'll catch her death. He gave a sigh. He looked grotesque. A serious-looking middle-aged man in an old woman's dress. The inspector wondered what he did in real life, what he normally looked like. I feel like we've already met, he said casually. Me too. I've seen you somewhere before. But where? Maybe you've bought a shirt in my shop. You're a haberdasher. On the Grands Boulevards, his wife was now making more noise than anyone. She was obviously drunk and was becoming quite over-exuberant. She was dancing with Basso and was clinging to him so tightly that Maigret turned away in embarrassment. A funny little girl. The man sighed. Little girl. This 30-year-old, buxom woman, with her sensual lips and her come-hither look, now throwing herself at her gentleman partner. She's a bit wild once she gets going. The inspector looked at his companion, unable to tell whether he was being angry or affectionate. At that moment, someone shouted, "They're off to the bridal chamber. Take your places, everyone." Where's the bridegroom? The bridal chamber was a small outhouse at the end of the lean-to. Someone got the door open. Someone else went to find the bridegroom at the end of the garden. Maigret was observing the real husband, who was smiling. First the garter, someone shouted. It was Monsieur Basso who removed the garter, cut it up into small pieces, and distributed them among the crowd. The bride and groom were bundled into the outhouse, and the door locked behind them. She's enjoying herself, murmured Maigret's companion. Are you married yourself? Oh, yes. Is your wife here? No, she's on holiday. Does she like being with young people too? Maigret couldn't tell if he was being serious or teasing. He took advantage of a lapse in conversation to cross the garden, passing close to the factory worker and his girlfriend, who were pressed up against a tree. In the kitchen, James was talking pleasantly with the old woman while drying glasses and emptying them. What's going on? He asked Maigret. Have you seen my wife? I haven't noticed her. Hard to miss her, surely. The night wound down quickly. It must have been around 1 in the morning. Some people started talking about making a move. Someone was being sick by the river. The bride had regained her freedom. Only the younger members of the group were still dancing. The carriage driver came up to James. Do you think it'll be much longer? The old woman's been waiting for me for an hour. You're married too. So James rounded everyone up. In the carriages, some people started nodding off to sleep, while others were trying to keep the party spirit going, singing and laughing with varying degrees of conviction. They passed a line of sleeping barges. A train whistled in the distance. They slowed down when they reached the bridge. The Bassos got out at their villa. The haberdasher had already left the group at Senport. A woman was whispering to her husband, who was drunk. I'll tell you tomorrow what you got up to. Shut up. I'm not listening. The sky was sprinkled with stars, which were reflected in the water of the river. At the Vieux Garçon, everyone was asleep. Handshakes all round. Are you coming sailing tomorrow? We're going fishing. Good night. You see. A row of bedrooms. Maigret asked James, is one of these for me? A. Take your pick. See if you can find an empty one. If not, you can always sleep in my room. Lights went on in a few windows. The sound of shoes being dropped on the floor, the squeak of bed springs. A couple whispered loudly in one of the rooms. Perhaps the woman who had a thing or two to say to her husband. It was 11 o'clock in the morning. Now they all looked like themselves. It was hot and sunny. The waitresses, dressed in black and white, bustled round the terrace, laying tables. The group began to reassemble. Some were still in pajamas, others in sailors' outfits, others still in flannels. Hungover, not too bad. And you? Some had already set off to go fishing, or had already returned. There were some small sailing dinghies and canoes. The haberdasher was wearing a well-tailored gray suit, clearly a man who liked to appear well-groomed in public. He spotted Maigret and came over. Allow me to introduce myself, Monsieur Feinstein. I mentioned my shop yesterday. My professional name is Marcel. Did you sleep well? No, I didn't. As I thought, my wife had made herself ill. It's always the same. She knows she doesn't have a robust constitution. Why did he seem so interested in Maigret's reaction? Have you seen her this morning? He looked around and finally spotted her in a sailing boat with 4 or 5 people in bathing costumes. Monsieur Basso was at the helm. Is this your first visit to Morsang? It's very nice. You'll want to come back. You'll see. We'll have the place to ourselves. Just the usual crowd. Friends? Do you play bridge? Oh, a bit. We'll be having a game later. Do you know Monsieur Basso? One of the biggest coal merchants in Paris? A splendid chap. That's his dinghy coming in now? Madame Basso is very sporty. And James, already on the booze? I shouldn't wonder. It's all he lives for. And he's still a young man. He could be doing something with his life. He'd rather take it easy. He works for an English bank in Place Vendôme. He's been offered loads of jobs, turned them all down. He insists on finishing work at 4 so he can hit the bars in Rue Royale. And that young man over there, the tall one, the son of a jeweler, and the man over there fishing, runs a plumbing business. He's the keenest fisherman in Morsang. Some of us play bridge. Others like fishing. Others prefer sailing. It all makes for a good crowd. Some people have their own villas out here. In the distance, at the first bend in the river, stood the tiny white house. One could just make out the lean-to with its mechanical piano. Does everyone go to the 2-penny bar? It's been our haunt for the last 2 years. James was the one who discovered it. Before that, it was just used by workers from Corbeil, who came here to dance on Sundays. James used to slip off there for a quiet drink when things got too boisterous around here. One day the gang went with him, had a bit of a dance, and that's how it all started. We've pretty much taken over the place. The former clientele has more or less drifted away. A waitress walked by with a tray full of aperitifs. Someone dived into the river. A frying smell came from the kitchen, and there was smoke rising from the chimney of the two-penny bar. A face came to Maigret's mind, thin, dark mustache, pointed teeth, quivering nostrils, Jean Lenoir pacing up and down to hide his fear, talking about the two-penny bar. There are others who deserve this, and I wish they were going down with me. But the next day, at the crack of dawn, he was alone. No one from the bar was there with him, despite the heat. Maigret felt a sudden chill, and he looked at this dapper haberdasher with his gold-tipped cigarette with fresh eyes. Then he turned to where the Basso's boat was being moored at the bank, half-naked people leaping ashore to greet their friends with handshakes. "May I introduce you to our friends?" said Monsieur Feinstein. "Monsieur Maigret, I'm a civil servant." The introductions were very proper short bows, exchanges of "pleased to meet you" and "the pleasure is all mine." "You were there yesterday evening, weren't you? I thought the whole thing went splendidly. Are you playing bridge with us this afternoon?" A thin, young man came up to Monsieur Feinstein, took him to one side, and spoke to him in a low voice. None of this was lost on Maigret. He saw Feinstein frown. He looked somewhat alarmed. He inspected Maigret from head to foot before adopting his normal demeanor. The group went up to the terrace to find a table. Pernod's all round. "Hey, where's James?" Monsieur Feinstein was edgy, despite his efforts to remain calm. He paid particular attention to Maigret. "What are you drinking?" "I don't mind." "You—" His sentence tailed off, and he pretended that something else had caught his attention. After a pause, he tried coming from a different angle. "It's odd that you should have landed up at Morsang." "Yes, very strange," the inspector agreed. The drinks were served. Everyone was talking over each other. Madame Feinstein had placed her foot on Monsieur Basso's, and her bright eyes were fixed on his. Such a lovely day. What a shame that the water is too clear for fishing. The air was clammy and still. Maigret remembered a shaft of sunlight penetrating a high white cell. Lenoir walking and walking to forget that he wouldn't be walking for much longer, and Maigret's gaze rested heavily on each face in turn. Monsieur Basso, the haberdasher, the businessman, James, who had just arrived, the young men and women. He tried to picture each of them in turn, by the Canal Saint-Martin at night, carrying a corpse like a shop dummy and trying to make it look like it's your friend walking next to you. "Your good health," said Monsieur Feinstein, maintaining his fixed smile for as long as he could. Chapter 3. Maigret had lunch on his own on the terrace of the Vieux Garçon. The rest of the group sat at adjoining tables, and the conversation flowed between them. He had now established the social background of this crowd tradesman, owners of small businesses, an engineer, 2 doctors. They were people who owned their own cars, but who only had Sundays off for unwinding in the countryside. They all owned boats, either motorboats or small dinghies. They were all keen on fishing. They lived here for 24 hours every week, dressed in their sailing gear, wandering around barefoot or in sandals. Some of them affected the rolling gait of old sea dogs, more couples than young people. They displayed the rather deep familiarity of people who have been spending every Sunday together for years. James was everyone's favorite, the person who bound them all together. With his casual manner, his ruddy complexion, and his dreamy eyes. He only had to make an appearance to put everyone in a good mood. How's the hangover, James? I never get hangovers. If I feel queasy, I find a couple of Pernots usually sorted out. They started reliving the night before. They had a laugh about someone who had been sick, and another who had almost fallen into the Seine on the way back. Maigret was part of the group without really belonging. The previous evening, everyone had talked to him like an old friend. Now they eyed him a little more cautiously, occasionally involving him in the conversation, out of politeness. Do you like fishing? The Bassos were having lunch at home. The Feinsteins, too, and a few others who had their own villas. Thus the group fell into two classes, those who owned villas and those who stayed at the inn. Around 2 o'clock, the haberdasher came to fetch Maigret. He seemed to have taken him under his wing. We're waiting for you to come and play bridge at your place. Yuki. At the Bassos. We were supposed to play at my place today, but the maid is sick, so we'll be better off at the Bassos. Are you coming, James? I'll come in the boat. The Bassos villa was a kilometer upstream. Maigret and Feinstein went on foot, while the rest went by dinghy or canoe. Basso's a fine fellow, don't you think? Maigret couldn't tell if he was being serious or not. He was a strange one. Neither one thing nor the other. Neither old nor young. Neither good-looking nor ugly. Maybe without a single original thought in his head. Yet maybe full of secrets. I expect we'll be seeing you every Sunday from now on. They came across groups of people picnicking, as well as fishermen, every 100 meters or so along the riverbank. It was getting hotter. The air was extraordinarily still and oppressive. In the Bassos garden, wasps buzzed around the flowers. There were 3 cars parked there already. The young boy was playing by the riverbank. You're joining our game, the coal merchant asked Maigret as he greeted him cordially. Excellent. In which case, we don't need to wait for James. He'll never get any wind in his sail on a day like today. Everything was brand new. The villa was like a city dweller's fantasy, a profusion of red-checked curtains, old Norman furniture and rustic pottery. The card table was set up in a living room that opened onto the garden through a large bay window. Bottles of Vouvray were chilling in an ice bucket frosted with condensation. Bottles of liqueur were set out on a tray. Madame Bassot, dressed in a nautical outfit, did the honors. Brandy, Quetcha, Mirabelle, unless you'd rather have a Vouvray. There were vague introductions to the other players, not all of whom had been present the night before, but who were still part of the Sunday crowd. Monsieur Maigret. Monsieur Maigret. Who plays bridge? It was almost like the set of a light opera. So vivid and spruce was the decor. Nothing to remind you of the serious business of life. The child had clambered into a white-painted canoe, and his mother called out, "Be careful. I'm going to meet James. A cigar, Monsieur Maigret. If you prefer a pipe, there is some tobacco in this pot. Don't worry, my wife is used to it." Directly opposite, on the other bank, stood the 2-penny bar. The first part of the afternoon passed uneventfully. Maigret noticed, however, that Monsieur Bassot wasn't playing, and that he appeared a little more on edge than this morning. He didn't look like the nervous type. He was tall and well-built and seemed to ooze vitality through every pore. A man who loved life, a rough and ready sort, from sturdy working-class stock. Monsieur Feinstein played bridge like a real aficionado and called Maigret to task on more than one occasion. At around 3 o'clock, the more sang crowd began to fill the garden, and then the room where they were playing. Someone put on a record. Madame Basso poured out the Vouvray, and 15 minutes later, there were half a dozen couples dancing around the bridge players. At that moment, Monsieur Feinstein, who had seemed completely absorbed by the game, murmured, "Hey, what's happened to our friend Basso? I think I saw him get into a boat," someone said. Maigret followed the haberdasher's gaze to the opposite bank of the river, where a small boat had just arrived right next to the two-penny bar. Monsieur Basso climbed out of it and walked up towards the inn. He returned a short while later, looking preoccupied, despite his ostensible air of good humor. Another incident which passed almost unnoticed. Monsieur Feinstein was winning at cards. Madame Feinstein was dancing with Basso, who had just come back. James, a glass of Vouvray in his hand, joked, "Some people couldn't lose if they tried." The haberdasher didn't flinch. He dealt out the cards. Maigret was watching his hands, and they were as steady as ever. Another hour or two went past. The dancers were getting tired. Some of the guests had gone for a swim. James, who had lost at cards, stood up and muttered, "How about a change of scene? Anyone for the two-penny bar?" "Richies." He bumped into Maigret on the way out. "Come with me." He had reached that level of drunkenness that he never went beyond, no matter how much he drank. The others all stood up. A young man cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, "Everyone to the two-penny bar." Careful you don't fall. James helped the inspector to climb into his 6-meter sailing boat, pushed off with a boat hook, and sat down in the stern. There wasn't a breath of wind. The sail flapped. They struggled against the current, even though it was virtually non-existent. "We're not in any hurry." Maigret saw Marcel Basso and Feinstein get into the same motorboat, cross the river in no time, and step out in front of the bar. Then came the dinghies and the canoes, though it had set out first. James's boat soon brought up the rear, because of the lack of wind, and the Englishmen seemed reluctant to use the oars. "They're a good bunch," James suddenly murmured, as if following his own line of thought. "Who?" "All of them. They have such boring lives. But what can you do about that? Everyone's life is boring." It was ironic, for as he lolled in the back of the boat with the sun glinting off his bald pate, he looked supremely content. "Is it true you're a policeman? Who told you that?" "I can't remember. I heard someone mention it. Hey, it's just a job like any other." James tightened the sail, which had caught a breath of wind. It was 6 o'clock. The Morsang clock was striking, and was answered by the one at Senport. The bank was obstructed by reeds, which were teeming with insects. The sun was beginning to turn red. "What do you—" James's question was cut short by a sharp crack. Maigret leapt to his feet, almost overturning the boat. "Look out!" his companion shouted. He threw his weight over to the other side, then grabbed an oar and started rowing. His brow was furrowed, his eyes wide with anxiety. "It's not the hunting season yet." "It came from behind the bar," said Maigret. As they drew closer, they could hear the tinkle of the mechanical piano and an anguished voice shouting, "Turn the music off! Turn the music off!" There were people running. A couple was still dancing, even after the piano was switched off. The old grandmother was coming out of the house, carrying a bucket in her hand. She stood stock still, trying to work out what was going on. Because of the reeds, it was difficult to land. In his haste, Maigret stepped into the water up to his knee. James came after him with his supple stride, mumbling to himself inaudibly. They only had to follow the group of people heading behind the lean-to that served as the dance hall. Round the back of the shed, they found a man staring wide-eyed at the crowd, stammering over and over. "It wasn't me, it was Basso." He seemed unaware that he was holding a small, pearl-handled revolver in his hand. "Where's my wife?" he asked the people around him, as if he didn't recognize them. Some people went to look for her. Someone said she stayed at home to prepare dinner. Maigret had to push his way to the front before he saw a figure lying in the long grass, dressed in a gray suit and a straw hat. Far from being tragic, the scene had an air of absurdity, with everyone standing around, not knowing what to do. They stood there looking in bewildered fashion at Basso, who seemed just as bewildered as they. To cap it all, one of the members of the group, who was a doctor, was standing right next to the body, but hadn't made a move. He was looking at the others, as if waiting for instructions. There was, however, a small moment of tragedy after all. The body suddenly twitched. The legs seemed to be trying to bend. The shoulders twisted back. A part of Monsieur Feinstein's face came into view. Then, as if in one last effort, he stiffened, then slowly became immobile. The man had just died. "Check his heart," Maigret told the doctor curtly. The inspector, who was not unfamiliar with such events, caught every detail of the scene. He saw everything at once, with an almost unreal clarity. Someone had fallen to the ground at the back of the crowd, wailing piteously. It was Madame Feinstein, who had been the last to arrive, because she had been the last to stop dancing. Some people were bending over her. The landlord of the bar was approaching with the suspicious expression of a distrustful peasant. Monsieur Basso was breathing quickly, pumping air into his lungs. He suddenly noticed the revolver in his clenched fist. He appeared stupefied. He looked at each of the persons around him in turn, as if wondering to whom he should give the gun. He repeated, "It wasn't me." He was still looking round for his wife, despite what he had been told. "Dead," said the doctor as he stood up. "A bullet. Here." And he pointed to the wound in the side, then looked round for his own wife, who was dressed in only a swimming costume. "Do you have a telephone?" Maigret asked the landlord. "No. You have to go to the station, or up to the lock." Marcel Basso was wearing white flannel trousers, and his shirt was partly unbuttoned, showing off the broadness of his chest. He rocked slightly on his feet, reached out a hand as if looking for some support, then suddenly slumped down in the grass less than 3 meters from the corpse and laid his head in his hands. The comic note returned. A thin female voice piped up. "He's crying." She thought she was whispering, but everyone heard. "Do you have a bicycle?" Maigret asked the landlord. "Of course." "Then cycle up to the lock and alert the police, at Corbeil or at Cesson." "It doesn't matter," Maigret observed Basso, feeling a little troubled. He took the revolver. Only one bullet had been fired. It was a woman's revolver, pretty, like a piece of jewelry. The bullets were tiny, nickel-plated. Yet it had only taken one to end the life of the haberdasher. There was hardly any blood, a reddish stain on his summer jacket. Otherwise, he was as neat and tidy as usual. Motto has taken a turn. Back in the house, a young man cried out. Mado was Madame Feinstein, whom they had laid on the innkeeper's tall bed. Everyone was watching Maigret. He felt a chill when a voice called out from the riverbank. Cooey, where are you? It was Pierrot, Basso's son, who was getting out of a canoe and was looking for the group. Quickly, don't let him come round. Marcel Basso was gathering himself together. He uncovered his face and stood up, confused by his recent show of weakness, and once again seemed to look for the person to whom he should be speaking. I'm a policeman, Maigret told him. You know, it wasn't me. Would you care to follow me? The inspector spoke to the doctor. I'm relying on you to make sure no one touches the body. And I would like to ask the rest of you to leave me and Monsieur Basso alone. The whole scene had been dragged out like a slow, badly directed play in the bright glare and oppressive atmosphere of the afternoon. Some anglers passed by on the towpath, their catches and baskets slung over their shoulders. Basso walked by Maigret's side. I just can't believe it. There was no spring in his step. When they turned the corner of the lean-to, they saw the river, the villa on the opposite bank, and Madame Basso rearranging the wicker chairs that had been left out in the garden. Mummy wants the key to the cellar, the little boy shouted from his canoe. But the man didn't reply. His expression changed to that of a hunted animal. Tell him where the key is. He summoned up his strength and called out, hanging on a hook in the garage. What's that? On a hook in the garage, and his words echoed faintly. Ragin'? What happened between you? Asked Maigret as they went inside the lean-to with the mechanical piano. Empty but for the glasses left on the tables. I don't know. Whose revolver is it? It's not mine. Mine is still in my car. Did Feinstein attack you? A long silence. Then he sighed. I don't know. I didn't do anything. I swear I didn't kill him. You were holding the gun when... I know. I don't know how that happened. Are you saying someone else pulled the trigger? No. You don't know how awful this is for me. Did Feinstein kill himself? He sat down on a bench and put his head in his hands once more. He grabbed an unfinished drink from the table and swallowed it in one go, with a grimace. With calm. What happens next? Are you going to arrest me? Oh, my cicayes. He stared at Maigret, his brow furrowed. But how did you happen to be there? You couldn't have known. He was struggling to make sense of everything, to tie together his tattered thoughts. He grimaced. It's like some sort of trap. The white canoe was on its way back from the far bank. Papa, the key isn't in the garage. Mummy wants to know. Mechanically, Basso felt his pockets. There was a tinkle of metal. He took out his keys and placed them on the table. Maigret took them across to the towpath and called out to the boy. Here, catch. Thank you, monsieur. The canoe moved off again. Madame Basso was laying the table for dinner with the help of the maid. Some of the canoes were heading back towards the Vieux Garçon. The landlord was cycling back from the lock, where he had made the phone call. Are you sure it wasn't you that pulled the trigger? Basso shrugged, gave a sigh, and didn't reply. The canoe reached the far bank. They could just make out the child and his mother talking. The maid was sent to fetch something inside the house and returned almost immediately. Madame Basso took the binoculars from her and trained them on the 2-penny bar. James was sitting in a corner, with the landlord and his family, pouring out large glasses of brandy and stroking the cat that had nestled in his lap. Chapter 4. It had been a dreary, tiring week, full of boring chores, time-consuming tasks, and countless petty frustrations. Paris remained oppressive, and around 6 every evening, heavy thunderstorms would turn the streets into rivers. Madame Maigret wrote from her holiday, "The weather's lovely. I've never seen such a crop of sloes." Maigret didn't like being in Paris without his wife. He ate without appetite in whichever restaurant was nearest to hand. He even stayed over in hotels so as not to go back home alone. The story had all begun in the sun-filled shop on Boulevard Saint-Michel, where Bassot was trying on a top hat. Then came the secret rendezvous in a furnished block in the Avenue Niel. A wedding party in the evening at the two-penny bar. A game of bridge and the unexpected drama. When the police had arrived on the scene, Maigret, who was off duty, left them to do their job. They had arrested the coal merchant. The prosecutor's office had been informed. 1 hour later, Monsieur Bassot was sitting between 2 police sergeants in the little railway station at Seine-Port. The Sunday crowd were all waiting for the train. The sergeant on the right offered him a cigarette. The lamps had been lit. Night had virtually fallen. When the train had arrived in the station and everyone was crowding to get on, Bassot shook off his captors, bustled his way through the crowd, ran across the rails, and made for the woods on the other side. The policemen couldn't believe their eyes. Only a few moments earlier, he had been sitting there quite calm and apparently docile between the pair of them. Maigret heard about the escape when he got back to Paris. It was an unpleasant night for everyone. The police searched the countryside around Morsang and Seine-Port, set up roadblocks, kept the railway stations under surveillance, and questioned passing motorists. The net spread out over nearly the whole department, and weekend ramblers returning home from their walks were astonished to find the gates of Paris manned by police. 2 policemen stood guard outside the Bassot house in Quai d'Austerlitz. 2 more in front of the block, where the Feinsteins had their private apartment in Boulevard des Batignolles. On Monday morning, Maigret had to go to the two-penny bar with magistrates from the prosecutor's office and got caught up in endless discussions. By Monday evening, nothing. It was almost certain that Bassot had slipped through the cordon and taken refuge in Paris or one of the surrounding towns, like Melun, Corbeil, or Fontainebleau. On Tuesday morning came the forensic report. A bullet fired from a distance of about 30 centimeters. It was impossible to determine whether the shot had been fired by Feinstein himself or by Bassot. Madame Feinstein identified the weapon as belonging to her. She was unaware that her husband had been carrying it in his pocket. Normally, the revolver was kept, loaded, in the young woman's bedroom. She was questioned at her flat in Boulevard des Batignolles. Unremarkable decor, few luxuries, very plain, and none too clean either. One maid to do everything. And Madame Feinstein wept. She wept and wept. It was more or less her only response. Apart from the odd, "If only I'd known," she had been Bassot's mistress for a few months. She loved him. Had you had other lovers before him? Monsieur, of course she'd had other lovers. Feinstein couldn't have kept a live wire like hers satisfied. How long have you been married? 8 years. Did your husband know about your affair? Oh, no. Didn't he suspect a little? Not at all. Do you think he would have been capable of threatening Bassot with the gun if he had found out something. I don't know. He was a strange man, very closed in on himself. Obviously, theirs was not a marriage based on great intimacy. Feinstein occupied with running his business. Motto left to her shopping and her secret liaisons, and Maigret glumly pursued his investigation, proceeding by the book, questioning the concierge, the suppliers, and the manager at Feinstein's shop in Boulevard des Capucines. The case was depressing in its banality, though there was something about it that didn't feel quite right. Feinstein had started off with a small haberdasher's on Avenue de Clichy. Then, 1 year after he got married, he took over a larger concern on the boulevards. With the help of a bank loan, from then on, it was the age-old story of a small business overstretching itself unpaid bills, bounced checks, loans, and beating the wolf from the door at the end of the month. Nothing shady, nothing improper, but nothing solid either. At home, too, they owed money to all the local tradesmen. In the dead man's office behind his shop, Maigret spent a good 2 hours going through his books. He found nothing unusual around the time of the crime Jean Lenoir had talked about the day before his execution. No large receipts, no out-of-the-ordinary expenses, absolutely nothing, a complete blank. The investigation was grinding to a halt. The most annoying part of it was questioning Madame Basso at Morsang. The inspector was surprised by her attitude, although clearly sad. She was hardly in despair. She showed a dignity of which Maigret would not have thought her capable. My husband must have had a good reason to run away. You don't think he's guilty? No, but he still ran away. Have you heard any word from him at all? No. How much money did he have on him? Not more than 10 francs. The coal merchant's affairs were the exact opposite of the haberdasher's. The business never made less than 500,000 francs, even in a bad year. The offices and the yard were well organized. There were 3 barges moored at the quayside. Marcel Basso had inherited the business from his father and had expanded it. Nor did the weather do much for Maigret's mood. Like all large people, he suffered from the heat, and Paris wilted under the hot sun every day until 3 in the afternoon. That's when the sky clouded over. The air crackled with electricity, and the wind began to gust, suddenly raising swirling plumes of dust from the streets. By late afternoon, it broke rumbles of thunder. Then a deluge of rain pounding the asphalt, seeping through the awnings of the cafe terraces, forcing people to seek shelter in doorways. It was on Wednesday that Maigret, caught in a sudden shower, sought shelter in the Tavern Royale. A man stood up and offered him his hand. It was James, who had been sitting alone at a table, nursing a Pernod. The inspector hadn't seen him before in his weekday clothes. He looked more like a bank clerk now than when he was all dressed up at Morsang. But he still somehow had the air of a circus performer. Care for a drink? Maigret was exhausted. There would be a couple of hours of rain to sit out. Then he would have to go back to the Quai des Orfèvres to catch up with any news. A Pernod. Normally he only drank beer, but he didn't raise any protest. He drank mechanically. James wasn't a bad companion, and he had one salient quality: he didn't talk much. He sat there in his cane armchair with his legs crossed, smoking cigarettes and watching the people scuttling past in the rain. When a paper boy came by, he bought an evening paper, flicked through it vaguely, then handed it to Maigret, indicating a paragraph with his finger. Marcel Basso, the murderer of the haberdasher from Boulevard des Capucines, is still at large, despite an extensive search by the police. What's your opinion? Maigret asked. James shrugged his shoulders, made a gesture of indifference. Do you think he's gone abroad? I don't think he'll have gone far. He's probably lying low in Paris. Why do you say that? I don't know. I think he must have had a reason for running away. Waiter, 2 more Pernots. Maigret had 3 glasses and slipped gently into a state he wasn't familiar with. He wasn't drunk, but he wasn't totally clear in the head either. He felt agreeably mellow. Sitting there on the terrace, he was able to think about the case in a more relaxed manner, almost with a degree of pleasure. James talked about this and that, without any hint of urgency. At 8 o'clock on the dot, he stood up and announced, "Time to go. My wife will be expecting me." Maigret was a little annoyed with himself for the time he'd wasted and for allowing himself to drink too much. He had dinner, then went back to his office. Neither the local police nor the Paris force had anything to report. The next day, Thursday, he plodded on with the inquiry with the same lack of enthusiasm. He waded through files dating back 10 years, but found nothing relating to the information Jean Lenoir had given. He looked through the legal registers. He rang around the hospitals and sanatoriums in the vague hope of finding Victor, Lenoir's friend with tuberculosis. There were lots of Victors, but not the right one. By midday, Maigret had a splitting head but no appetite. He had lunch in Place Dauphine, in a little restaurant popular with police officers. Then he phoned Morsang, where policemen had been posted outside the Bassos villa. No sign. Madame Basso was carrying on with life as normal with her son. She read all the papers. The villa didn't have a telephone. At 5 o'clock, Maigret came out of the apartment block on the Avenue Niel. He had come on the off chance of digging something up, but hadn't found anything. Then mechanically, as if he'd already been doing it for years, he headed off to the Taverne Royale, where he was greeted by James, and sat down beside him. "What's new?" James asked him. Then, before he could answer, called out, "2 Pernots." The storm was behind schedule today. The streets remained bathed in sunlight. Coachloads of tourists drove past. "The most straightforward hypothesis," Maigret murmured, as if to himself. "The one the newspapers seem to favor is that Basso was attacked by his companion for some reason or another, grabbed hold of the gun that was pointed at him, and shot the haberdashers." Which is rubbish. Maigret looked at James, who also seemed to be talking to himself. "Why do you say it's rubbish?" "Because if Feinstein had wanted to kill Basso, he'd have been a bit more calculating than that. He was a cool customer, a skillful bridge player." The inspector couldn't help smiling at the serious tone in which James said this. "So what's your theory?" "I don't exactly have a theory. Just that Basso should never have got involved with Motto. You can tell just by looking at her that she's not the sort of woman who lets a man go easily. Once she's got her claws into him. Had her husband shown any signs of being jealous? What, him?" And James gave Maigret a curious look. There was an ironic twinkle in his eye. "Don't you know?" James shrugged his shoulders and murmured, "It's none of my business." Besides, if he was the jealous type, then most of the Morsang gang would be dead by now. "You mean they were all—" "Well, not all. Let's not exaggerate. Let's just say that Motto danced with everyone. And when you danced with Motto, you could end up disappearing into the bushes of Bussasus, including you." "I don't dance," James replied. "If what you say is true, then Feinstein must have known." The Englishman sighed. "I don't know. But he did owe all of them money." At first sight, James came across as a drunken oaf. But there was a lot more to him than met the eye. Maigret whistled. "Well, well, 2 Pernots. 2. Yes, Motto didn't even have to know. It was all very discreet. Feinstein tapped his wife's lovers for money, without letting on that he knew, but leaving the implication hanging in the air. They didn't talk much after that. The storm still hadn't broken. Maigret drank his Pernod's, his eyes fixed on the crowds flowing past in the street outside. He was comfortably ensconced in his chair, turning over in his mind this new complexion on the case. 8 o'clock. James shook his hand and set off. Just at the moment, the storm was beginning to break. By Friday, it had become a daily habit. Maigret headed for the Taverne Royale almost without realizing it. At one point, he couldn't resist asking, "Don't you ever go home after work? Between 5 and 8, you seem to..." "You have to have a little bolt hole to call your own." James sighed, and James's bolt hole was a cafe terrace, a marble-topped table, a cloudy aperitif. His view was the columns of the Madeleine, the waiters' white aprons, and the crowds and traffic in the street. "How long have you been married?" 8 years. Maigret didn't dare ask him whether he loved his wife. In any case, James would probably say yes. Only after 8 o'clock, after the bolt hole, Maigret wondered whether they were starting to become friends. Today, they didn't discuss the case. Maigret drank his 3 Pernod's. He needed to blot out the hard day he'd had. His life was clogged up with trivial problems. It was the holidays, and he was having to fill in for several absent colleagues. And the examining magistrate in the 2-penny bar case never gave him a moment's peace. He had sent him to interrogate Motto Feinstein for a second time, told him to examine the haberdasher's books and to question Basso's employees. The police were already short-handed, and a number of officers were pinned down watching the places where the fugitive was likely to show up. This all put the chief in a bad mood. "Haven't you got this one sorted out yet?" he had asked that morning. Maigret agreed with James. He sensed that Basso was in Paris, but how had he been able to get hold of money? And if he hadn't, how was he living? What was he hoping for? What was he expecting to happen? What was he doing with himself? His guilt had not been proven. If he had stayed in custody and hired a good lawyer, he could have hoped, if not for acquittal, then at least a light sentence, after which he could return to his business, his wife and his son. Instead of that, he was running away, in hiding, and thus giving up all his former life. He must have his reasons, James had said, in his usual philosophical way. "Don't let us down. We'll be at station, love." It was Saturday. Madame Maigret had sent an affectionate ultimatum. Her husband wasn't yet sure how to reply. But at 5 o'clock, he was at the Taverne Royale, shaking James's hand. James ordered as usual, Pernod, as on the previous Saturday. There was a rush to the stations, a continuous stream of taxis piled high with luggage, the bustle of people getting away on holiday. "Are you going to Morsang?" "Yes, as usual. It'll be a strange atmosphere." The inspector wanted to go to Morsang himself. On the other hand, he wanted to see his wife, to go trout fishing in the rivers of Alsace, to breathe in the lovely smells of his sister-in-law's house. He couldn't make his mind up. He vaguely observed James get up and head to the back of the bar. There was nothing unusual in this. He thought nothing of it, and barely registered the fact that his companion returned after a few moments and sat down again. 10 minutes went past. A waiter approached. "Is one of you 2 gentlemen, Monsieur Maigret?" "That's me." "What is it?" "A phone call for you." Maigret stood up and went to the back of the bar, frowning. Despite his inebriation, he could smell something fishy. When he went into the box, he turned round to see James looking at him from the terrace. "Strange," he muttered. "Hello, hello. This is Maigret. Who's calling?" He started to snap his fingers impatiently. Finally, there was a woman's voice at the other end of the line. "How can I help you? Hello? Who's there? This is the operator. Which number do you require?" "But you called me." "Mademoiselle." "Not so, monsieur. This number hasn't been rung for at least 10 minutes. Please hang up him." He bashed the door open with his fist. Outside, in the shade of the terrace, there was a man standing next to James. It was Marcel Basso. He looked different in new, ill-fitting clothes. He was keeping an anxious eye on the door of the phone box. He saw Maigret at the same moment the latter spotted him. Maigret saw his lips move, a few quick words. Then he dashed off into the crowds outside. "How many call?" the cashier asked the inspector. But Maigret was running. The terrace was crowded. He had to weave his way through, and by the time he reached the street, there was no way of knowing in which direction Basso had fled. There were dozens of taxis out on the street. Had he hopped into one of them, or even leaped onto a passing bus? Maigret returned to his table, scowling. He sat down without a word, without looking at James, who hadn't moved a muscle. A waiter approached. "The cashier would like to know how many calls you made." "Damn." He noticed a smile on James's lips and said crossly, "Congratulations. You reckon? How long did it take you to hatch this little scheme?" It was pretty much off the cuff. "Waiter, 2 Pernod's and some cigarettes." "What did he say to you? What did he want?" And James leaned back in his chair and merely sighed, as if he couldn't see the point of this conversation. Money. And where did he get hold of that suit he was wearing? He can't be expected to walk around Paris in white flannels. That was indeed what Basso was wearing when he ran away at Saint-Port Station. James forgot nothing. "Have you contacted him prior to today?" "He contacted me, and you have nothing to say. You'd do the same as me. I've been a guest at his house hundreds of times. He's never done me any harm." "Did he want money?" "He's been watching us for half an hour. I thought I saw him yesterday across the road. He just didn't dare come over. So you had me summoned to the phone." He seemed tired. "Did he say anything?" "It's weird how different clothes can change a man." James sighed, evading the question. Maigret observed him, out of the corner of his eye. "Are you aware that, by rights, you could be arrested for aiding and abetting? There are lots of things you can do by rights, but rights aren't always right." He was clowning around as usual. "Waiter, where are those Pernod's?" "Coming. Are you coming down to Morsang? Because if you are, we may as well get a taxi. It's only 100 francs, and the train costs." "What about your wife?" "She always comes by taxi, with her sister and her friends, 5 of them. That works out at 20 francs a head, whereas the train costs—" "Okay, coming or not?" "I'm coming." "Waiter, how much is that?" "Excuse me, separate bills, as usual." It was a matter of principle. Maigret paid for his own drinks, James for his. He added 10 francs for the phone call. In the taxi, James appeared preoccupied. When they reached Villejuif, he revealed what was on his mind. "I wonder where we'll be playing bridge tomorrow afternoon." It was time for the storm. The first drops of rain began to streak the windscreen. Chapter 5. They might have expected to find a different atmosphere at Morsang. It had only been the previous Sunday that the events had taken place. One of the group was now dead. Another was a wanted murderer. Nevertheless, when James and Maigret arrived, they found a group of people standing around a new car, admiring it. They had exchanged their weekday clothes for their sports gear. Only the doctor was still dressed in a suit. It was his car, and he was giving it its first outing. Everyone was asking questions, and he was extolling its special features. Yes, it does guzzle more gas, but almost everyone had a car. The doctor's was brand new. The engine purrs. Just listen to this. His wife was sitting contentedly inside the car, happy to let the confab take its course. Dr. Mertens was about 30, skinny as a rake, as limp-wristed as a sickly young girl. "Is that your new car?" James asked, bursting into the conversation. He strode around it, muttering to himself inaudibly, "I wouldn't mind taking it for a spin tomorrow. Is that all right with you?" One would have thought that Maigret's presence would disturb them. They hardly noticed he was there. They all felt so at home at the inn. They came and went as they pleased. "Your wife not with you, James?" "She's coming with Marcel and Lily." They took their canoes out of the garage. Someone was repairing a fishing rod with some silk cord. They all did their own thing until dinner time. There wasn't much conversation during the meal, just the odd exchange here and there. "Is Madame Basso at home? What a week she must have had. What are we doing tomorrow?" Maigret was like a spare part. Everyone avoided him, without making it too obvious. When James wasn't with him, he would wander the terrace or the riverbank alone. When night fell, he slipped off to check with the officers who were guarding the Bassos' villa. There were 2 of them on duty. They took it in turn to take their meals in a bistro in Saint-Port, 2 kilometers away. When the inspector arrived, the one who was off duty was fishing. "Anything to report?" "Not a thing. She keeps herself to herself. Every now and again she takes a tour round the garden. The tradesmen have been calling as usual, the baker at 9, the butcher a short while later. Then the greengrocer comes by with his cart around 11. There was a light on the ground floor. They could make out the silhouette of the boy drinking his soup with a serviette tied around his neck. The policemen were stationed in a little wood on the riverbank. The one who was fishing said, "This place is teeming with rabbits. If we weren't on a job." Opposite, the 2-penny bar, where 2 couples, probably workers from Corbeil, were dancing to the strains of the mechanical piano. A Sunday morning like any other at Morsang, with anglers all along the banks, others sitting immobile in green-painted dinghies anchored at both ends. Canoes, a couple of sailing boats. It was a well-ordered routine that nothing was going to disrupt. The countryside was pretty. The sky was clear. Everyone was at peace. Perhaps that's why the scene was as sickly as an overly sweet dessert. Maigret found James dressed in a blue and white striped sweater, white trousers and espadrilles, with an American sailing cap perched on his head. He was sipping a large glass of brandy and water by way of breakfast. "Did you sleep well?" "Shamata Yusukicho." Maigret noticed one amusing detail in Paris. He always addressed Maigret with the formal vous. Here in Morsang, he used the familiar tu for everyone, including the inspector, without even realizing. "What are you up to this morning?" "I think I'll drop in on the 2-penny bar." "I'll see you there." Apparently, we've arranged a get-together there for pre-lunch drinks. "Do you want to borrow a canoe?" Anashush Tanshui. Maigret was the only one in dark city clothes. He was given a small, flat-bottomed boat, which he had great trouble keeping steady. When he arrived at the two-penny bar, it was 10 o'clock in the morning, and there wasn't a customer in sight. Or rather, there was one, in the kitchen, munching on a hunk of bread and a fat sausage. The old woman was saying to him, "You want to take better care. One of my lads didn't look after himself properly, and it killed him. And he was bigger and stronger than you." At that moment, the customer had a coughing fit and couldn't swallow his mouthful of bread. As he was coughing, he noticed Maigret standing at the door, and he frowned. "A bottle of beer," said the inspector. "Wouldn't you prefer to sit out on the terrace?" No, he preferred the kitchen, with its table scored by knife marks, its rush chairs, and its stove, on which a large pot was bubbling away. "My son has gone off to Corbeil to chase up some bottles of soda water they forgot to deliver. Would you help me open the trap door?" The trap door in the middle of the kitchen was open to reveal the gaping hole of a damp cellar. The stooping old woman went down into it while the customer never took his eyes off Maigret. He was a pale, thin young man of about 25 with blonde stubble on his cheeks. He had deep-set eyes and thin, colorless lips. But what was most striking about him was what he was wearing. He wasn't dressed in rags, like a vagabond, nor did he have that insolent look of the professional tramp. No, he displayed a strange mixture of shyness and self-confidence. He was humble and aggressive at the same time. He was both clean and dirty. His clothes were neat and well kept, even though he looked as if he had been on the road for days. "Show me your papers, please." Maigret had no need to identify himself as a policeman. The boy had grasped that straight away. He took a grubby army identity card from his pocket. The inspector read the name under his breath. Victor Gaillard. He calmly closed the card and returned it to its owner. The old woman came back up from the cellar and closed the trap door. "Nice and cold," she said, opening the bottle of beer, and she went back to peeling potatoes while the two men began talking in a steady, dispassionate tone. "Last address, the municipal sanatorium in Guyenne. When did you leave?" Miss, decide. "A month ago. And since then, I've been broke. On the road. You could arrest me for vagrancy, but they just put me back in a sanatorium. I've only got one lung left." There was nothing self-pitying in his tone. On the contrary, it was as if he were presenting his credentials. "Did you get a letter from Lenoir?" "Who's Lenoir? Stop messing about. He told you you'd find your man at the two-penny bar. I'd had enough of the sanatorium and thought you'd squeeze a bit more out of the guy from the Canal Saint Martin." The old woman listened without understanding, without showing any surprise. It was as if they were having an everyday conversation in this run-down country kitchen, where a hen had wandered in and was pecking away around their feet. "Have you got nothing to say? I don't know what you're talking about." "Lenoir told me everything. I don't know any Lenoir." Maigret shrugged his shoulders, lit his pipe, and repeated, "Stop messing about. You know I know what you're up to. What's the worst they can do? Send me back to the sanatorium." I know. You've only got one lung." Some canoes glided past on the river. "What Lenoir told you is true. Your man is here." "I'm not saying anything. So much the worse for you. If you haven't changed your mind by this evening, I'll have you locked up for vagrancy. After that, we'll see." Maigret looked him in the eye. He could read him like a book. He'd met his sort before. A different kettle of fish entirely from Lenoir. Victor was the sort who rode on the back of the bigger villains, the one who's always put on lookout duty and gets the smallest share of the loot. He was one of those types who is easily led astray and doesn't have the strength of character to get back on the rails. He had started hanging around the streets and the dance halls at the age of 16. With Lenoir, he had landed on his feet that night at the Canal Saint-Martin and had managed to live off the proceeds of his blackmail as if it were a regular salary. But for his tuberculosis, he would probably have become a stooge in Lenoir's gang. But his ill health meant he ended up in the sanatorium. He must have driven the doctors and nurses to despair with his thieving and petty misdemeanors. Maigret guessed that he had faced the courts on more than one occasion and had been in and out of various sanatoriums, hospitals, hospices, and young offenders institutions. He wasn't afraid. He had the same answer to everything his lung. He'd be living off it until the day it killed him. What do I care? Are you refusing to tell me the name of the man at the canal? Don't know what you're talking about. There was an ironic twinkle in his eyes as he said this. He bit off a large chunk of sausage and started chewing it assiduously. I know Lenoir wouldn't have said anything, he murmured, after a pensive pause. Not like that, right at the end. Maigret stayed cool. He knew he had the upper hand. What's more, he now had a new means of getting to the truth. Another beer, please, madam. A good thing I brought 3 bottles up. She gave Victor a curious look, as if trying to work out what crime he could have committed. To think you were well taken care of in the sanatorium and you left. Just like my son. He'd rather have his freedom than... Maigret watched the canoes row past in the bright sunlight outside. It was nearly time for drinks. A sailing boat containing James's wife and 2 of her friends pulled in at the riverbank outside. The 3 women beckoned to a canoe, which followed close behind. Other boats followed. The old woman sighed. My son hasn't got back yet. I won't be able to manage on my own. My daughter has gone to fetch the milk. Nevertheless, she gathered up some glasses, which she took out to the tables on the terrace. Then she dug some loose change out of a pocket concealed under her petticoats. They'll need some pennies for the piano. Maigret stayed where he was, one eye on the new arrivals and the other on his sickly companion, who continued to munch away unperturbed. And he noticed the Basso's villa in the background, with its blooming garden, its diving board next to the river, its 2 boats moored at the bank, the child's swing. He gave a sudden start when he heard what sounded like a shot being fired in the distance. The people next to the river looked up too, but there was nothing to be seen. Nothing happened. 10 minutes went by. The guests from the Vieux Garçon took their seats around the tables. The old woman came out, carrying several bottles of apéritif. Then a dark figure ran down the Bassos lawn. Maigret recognized one of the police officers. He fumbled with the chain of one of the boats, got in, and started rowing towards them with all his might. Maigret stood up and turned to Victor. You stay put. Happy to oblige. Outside, everyone had stopped ordering drinks, intent on the sight of the officer rowing across. Maigret walked down to the reeds by the river and waited impatiently. What's happened? The officer was out of breath. Get in. I swear it wasn't my fault. With Maigret on board, he started rowing back across to the villa. It was all quiet. The greengrocer had just been round. Madame Basso was walking in the garden with the child. I don't know why. I just had this feeling something was up, like they were expecting something. Then a car pulled up, a brand new car. It parked just outside the gate, and a man got out, balding, in his 30s. That's right, he came into the garden and started walking with Madame Basso and the boy. You know where my observation post is. It's a fair distance away. They shook hands. The woman walked the man back to the gate. He climbed in and turned on the ignition. And before I could make a move, Madame Basso jumped in with the boy, and the car sped off. Who fired the shot? I did. I was trying to puncture a tire. Was Berger with you? Yes, I sent him to Saint-Port to phone around everyone. This was the second time they'd had to alert all the police stations in Seine-et-Oise. The boat reached the far bank. Maigret went into the garden. But what could they do there now? There was nothing to do but phone around and alert the other stations. Maigret bent over to pick up a woman's handkerchief, embroidered with Madame Basso's initials. She had pulled it to ribbons as she had nervously waited for James to appear. What upset the inspector the most was the thought of all those hours he had whiled away drinking Pernod with the Englishman on the terrace of the Taverne Royale. Now, he resented that. He was annoyed that he had let down his guard and allowed himself to be sucked in. Shall I carry on keeping an eye on the villa? In case the bricks run off Namago and find Berger, then the two of you help with the search. Try and get hold of a motorbike and bring me hourly updates. On the kitchen table, next to the vegetables, there was an envelope bearing James's writing, to be delivered without fail to Madame Basso. Obviously, the greengrocer had delivered the letter. It told the young woman what was going to happen. That's why she was nervously patrolling the garden with her son. Maigret rode back to the two-penny bar. He found the group gathered round the vagrant. Someone had given him an aperitif, and the doctor was asking him questions. Victor had the cheek to give the inspector a look, as if to say, "I'm busy. Leave me alone." And he continued with his explanation. He was an important professor. Apparently, they filled my lung with oxygen. Right, and then they sealed it like a balloon. The doctor smiled at the way he described it, but nodded to his companions to show that what he was saying was true. Now, they have to do the same thing with the half lung on the other side, because you've got two lungs, see? Or, in my case, 1.5. And you drink alcohol. Yeah, cheers. Do you get cold sweats at night? Sometimes. When I sleep in drafty barns. What are you drinking, Inspector? Someone asked. Has something happened that they had to come and fetch you like that? Tell me, doctor, did James borrow your car this morning? He asked if he could take it for a spin. He'll be back soon. I very much doubt it. The doctor gave a start, then tried to smile as he stammered. You're joking, of course. I assure you I'm quite serious. He's just used it to abduct Madame Basso and her son. What? James, the doctor's wife asked, unable to believe her ears. Yes, James, it must have been a joke. He really likes a good hoax. Victor was greatly amused by this. He sipped his drink and looked at Maigret with a sardonic smile. The landlord returned from Corbeil in his little pony and trap. As he was unloading the bottles of soda water, he happened to say, "What a palaver. You can't go down the road now without being stopped by the police. Luckily, they know who I am." Was this on the road to Corbeil? Yes, just a few minutes ago. There are 10 of them next to the bridge. They're stopping cars and asking everyone to show their papers. So there's a tailback of about 30 cars. Maigret turned away. It was nothing to do with him. It had to be done. But it was an extremely crude and heavy-handed method. And it was a lot for people to put up with 2 Sundays in a row. In the same department, especially for a small-scale crime that had had very little coverage in the newspapers. Had he lost track of the case? Had he been left floundering in the wake of events? Once again, The memory of the hours spent drinking with James in the Tavern Royale came back to haunt him. "What are you drinking?" he heard a voice ask. A large Pernod. The very word was enough to remind him of the week gone by. The Sunday get-togethers of the Morsang crowd. The whole disagreeable case. "A beer," he replied. At this hour, the well-meaning waiter who had offered him the aperitif was taken aback at the fury of Maigret's response. Yes, at this hour, Victor, too, received a bad-tempered look. The doctor was talking about him to the fisherman. "I've heard of the treatment, but I've never seen such a thoroughgoing application of the technique of pneumothorax." Then, in a whisper, "Not that it'll make much difference. I'd give him a year at most." Maigret had lunch at the Vieux Garçon, ensconced in a corner like a wounded beast, growling if anyone came near. Twice the police officer came on his motorbike to report in. Nothing. The car was spotted on the road to Fontainebleau, but hasn't been seen since. Marvelous. A traffic jam on the Fontainebleau road, hundreds of cars held up. 2 hours later, it was reported that a car matching the description of the doctor's car had filled up at a petrol station at Arpajon. But was it the right one? The petrol pump attendant had sworn there was no woman in the car. Finally, at 5 o'clock, a message from Montlhéry. The car had been seen doing circuits of the racetrack, as if on a time trial, when it blew a tire. By sheer chance, a policeman had asked the driver for his license. He didn't have one. It was James, and he was on his own. They were waiting for Maigret's instructions whether to let him go or lock him up. They were brand new tires, the doctor moaned, and on its first time out, I'm beginning to think he's mad, or else he's drunk, as usual. And he asked Maigret if he could come with him. Chapter 6. They made a detour to the two-penny bar to pick up Victor. Once he was in the car, he turned and gave the landlord a look, which meant something like, "You see the special treatment I'm getting." He was sitting on the fold-down seat, facing Maigret. The window was wound down, and he had the impudence to ask, "Do you mind if I close it?" "It's because of my lung. You know, at the track, there were no races on today. There were a few drivers doing practice laps in front of the empty stands. The emptiness of the place, if anything, made it seem more vast. A short distance away, a parked car. A police officer was standing next to a man in a leather helmet who was on his knees tinkering with his bike. Over there, the inspector was told. Victor was fascinated by a racing car hurtling around the track at around 200 kilometers an hour. Now, he opened the window so he could lean out to get a better view. "It's my car, all right," said the doctor. "I hope it isn't damaged." Then they saw James, standing quite calmly next to the motorcyclist, stroking his chin, giving advice on how to fix the engine. When he saw Maigret and his companions approach, he murmured, "That was quick." Then he looked at Victor from head to toe, as if wondering what he was doing there. Who's this? If Maigret had been hoping for something from this meeting, he was disappointed. Victor scarcely noticed the Englishman. He was too interested in watching the racing car. The doctor was already inspecting the inside of his car for any signs of damage. "Have you been here long?" the inspector growled. "I'm not sure. Quite long. Yes." He was so self-possessed. It was unbelievable. You wouldn't think to look at him that he had just whisked away a woman and her child from under the noses of the police. And because of him, the entire Seine-et-Oise force was on a state of alert. "Don't worry," he said to the doctor. "Nothing worse than a puncture. The rest of the car is intact. It's a good machine. The clutch is a little sticky. Perhaps. Did Basso ask you yesterday to pick up his wife and child? You know very well I can't answer questions like that. My dear Maigret, and I don't suppose you will tell me where you dropped them off. I'm sure if you were in my shoes, I'll give you credit for one thing. Something even a professional criminal wouldn't have thought of. James was modestly surprised. What's that? The racetrack. Having delivered Madame Basso safely, you didn't want the police to find the car straight away. And since there were roadblocks everywhere, you thought of the racetrack. You could have driven round and round for hours. I'd always fancied having a go at it, you know, but the inspector wasn't listening. He dashed over to the doctor, who was attempting to fit the spare tire. I'm sorry. The car stays put until we receive the order to release it. What? But this is my car. I haven't done anything. It was no use protesting. The car was put into a lockup, and Maigret took away the key. The policeman awaited instructions. James smoked a cigarette. Victor was still watching the racing cars. Take him away, said Maigret, indicating Victor, and put him in a cell. What about me? James asked. Do you still have nothing to say to me? Not really. Put yourself in my shoes. Maigret sulkily turned his back on him. Maigret was delighted when it began to rain on the Monday. The gray weather chimed in better with his mood and the tedious tasks of the day. Among them, he had to write a report on the events of the day before, in which he had to justify his deployment of the officers under his command. At 11 o'clock, 2 officers from criminal records came to collect him from his office, and all 3 of them took a taxi to the racetrack, where Maigret was able to do little except watch his colleagues at work. They knew that the doctor had clocked up only 60 kilometers since buying the car. The dial now showed 210 kilometers. They reckoned that James must have done about 50 kilometers at the racetrack. That left about 100 kilometers to account for. The distance between Morsang and Montlhéry was barely 40 kilometers by the most direct route. Using this information, they were able to mark a circle on a route map showing the maximum area the car could have reached. The 2 experts worked meticulously. They carefully scraped the tires, gathered up the dust and other debris, and examined it under a magnifying glass, putting some of it aside for further analysis. Fresh tar, one of them said, and the other examined a special map provided by the transport department, looking for places within their circle where there were current roadworks. There were 4 or 5, all in different directions. The first expert said, chalk deposits. Now they consulted a military map. Maigret walked up and down glumly, smoking his pipe. No calcareous soil in the Fontainebleau area, but between La Ferté-Alais and Arpajon, I found some grains of wheat in the tread, and so the evidence accumulated. The maps became covered in blue and red lines. At 2 o'clock, they rang the town hall at La Ferté-Alais to find out whether any firm in the town was currently using Portland cement in such a way that some of it could have found its way onto the road. They didn't get their answer until 3 o'clock. There's building work going on at the Essonne Mills. There's cement on the main road from La Ferté to Arpajon. They had pinned down one thing. The car had definitely passed through there. The experts took away a few other objects to examine more closely in the laboratory. Maigret checked off all the towns and villages within the circle on the map and rang round the relevant police stations and municipal offices. At 4 o'clock, he left his office intending to interrogate Victor, whom he had not seen since the previous day, and who was now held in the temporary cell at the foot of the stairs at the police headquarters. As he descended the stairs, however, he had an idea. He returned to his office and telephoned the accountant of Basso's firms. "Hello, police. Could you tell me the name of your bank?" "The Banque du Nord, Boulevard Haussmann. Thank you." He had himself driven to the bank, where he asked to see the manager. 5 minutes later, Maigret had another lead in his inquiry. At 10 o'clock that morning, James had cashed a check for 300,000 francs drawn up by Marcel Bassos. The check was dated 4 days previously. "Boss, the guy downstairs wants to see you. Says he has something important to tell you." Maigret walked ponderously downstairs and entered the cell, where Victor was sitting on a bench, leaning on the table with his head in his hands. "I'm listening." The prisoner stood up briskly. He had a cunning look on his face. Shifting from one foot to the other, he said, "You haven't found anything yet, have you?" Still pursuing our inquiries. "See, you haven't found anything yet. I'm not stupid. Anyway, last night I had a bit of a think-all." "You've decided to talk." "Hold on. We need to reach an understanding. I don't know if Lenoir talked or not. If he did, he didn't tell you everything. Without me, you won't get anywhere. That's a fact. You're stuck. And you're going to stay that way. So, this is what I've got to say. Information like that's got to be worth something. Got to be worth a lot. Let's say I went and found the murderer and told him I was going to tell the police everything. Don't you think he'd cough up whatever I asked for?" Victor had that triumphant look of the underdog who suddenly finds himself in a position of power. All his life, the police had hassled him, and now he felt that he had the upper hand. He was strutting around, looking very pleased with himself. "So there it is. Why would I talk? Why would I harm someone who hasn't done me any wrong? You think you can put me away for vagrancy? You're forgetting my lung. They'll send me to a hospital, then to a sanatorium." Maigret looked at him steadily, but didn't say a word. "How's about 30,000 francs? It's not a lot. Just enough to see me through to the end, which can't be long now. 30 grand. What's a piddling amount like that to the government?" He imagined he already had the money in his hands. He was exultant. He was interrupted by a coughing fit, which brought tears to his eyes, but they were like tears of triumph. Wasn't he smart? Wasn't he in the driving seat? "That's my final offer. 30,000 francs, and I tell you everything. You'll get your man. There'll be a promotion in it for you. You'll have your name in the papers. Otherwise, nothing you can do what you like with me. Just remember, it all took place 6 years ago, and there were only 2 witnesses, Lenoir, who won't be saying any more. And yours truly." "Is that it?" asked Maigret, who had remained standing the whole time. "You think it's too much?" Victor felt a pang of disquiet at Maigret's calm, inscrutable reaction. "I'm not scared of you. You know." He gave a forced laugh. "I know the score. You could rough me up a bit, but I'd tell the papers how the police beat up a poor invalid with 1 lung. Are you finished? Don't think you'll find the truth on your own, if you ask me. 30,000 francs is not much to pay. Are you finished? And if you think I'm stupid enough to go after the guy, if you let me go, you've got another think coming. I won't write to him. I won't ring him." His tone had changed now. He felt the ground slipping under him, but he was still trying to put on a brave face. "Anyway, I want to see a lawyer. You can't keep me here more than 24 hours. Maigret blew out a little puff of smoke, thrust his hands in his pockets, and left the cell. On the way out, He said to the warder, "Lock him in." He was angry. And now he was on his own. He could let it show in his face. He was angry because he had this idiot in his grasp, at his mercy. But he couldn't get anything out of him. And that was because he was an idiot. Because he thought he was cunning and tough. He thought he could use his lung as a form of blackmail. Three or four times during this interview, the inspector had almost struck him across the face to knock some sense into him, but had managed to restrain himself. In truth, his hand was not a strong one. Legally, he had nothing on Victor. He had plenty of previous form, for sure. He'd led his whole life going from one petty crime to the next. But there was nothing new, except a vagrancy charge that Maigret could get him on, and he was right about the lung. He'd have everyone on his side. The newspapers would devote several column inches to portraying the police as monsters. Dying man, beaten by police. So he stood there, calm as you like, demanding to be paid 30,000 francs. And he was right when he said they would soon have to release him. Let him out tonight at around 1 o'clock. Tell Sergeant Lucas to follow him and not to let him out of his sight. And Maigret clenched his teeth round the stem of his pipe. Victor knew. And he only had to say one word. Now, Maigret was stuck with having to concoct theories out of diverse, and sometimes contradictory, evidence. He hailed a taxi and barked at the driver. To the Taverne Royale. James wasn't there. 8 o'clock came, and he still hadn't turned up. The doorman at the bank confirmed that he had left at 5 as usual. Maigret had a meal of choucroute, then phoned his office around 8:30. "Has the prisoner asked to see me?" Sir. "Yes, he says he's given the matter more thought, and he's willing to come down to 25,000. That's his final offer. And he wants it put on the record that a man in his condition shouldn't be fed bread without butter and be forced to stay in a cell where the temperature never gets above 16 degrees. Maigret put down the receiver. He went for a short walk in the boulevards, then caught a taxi to Rue Championnet, where James lived. His block was enormous, like a barracks. It contained small apartments inhabited by office workers, commercial travelers, and small investors. Fourth, on the left, there was no lift. So the inspector slowly climbed the stairs, catching a whiff of cooking or hearing children's voices from behind the doors on each landing. James's wife answered the door. She was dressed in a pretty royal blue dressing gown. It wasn't particularly luxurious, but it didn't look that cheap either. "You wish to speak to my husband?" The entrance hall was barely wider than a dining table. On the walls were pictures of sailing boats, bathers, young men and women in sporting garbs. "It's for you, James." She pushed open a door, ushered Maigret through, and sat back down in her armchair next to the window, where she picked up her crochet. The other apartments in the block were still decorated in the style of the last century, with their Henry II and Louis Philippe furniture. This apartment, however, felt more like Montparnasse than Montmartre. It owed more to the decorative arts and style, but seemed to be the work of an amateur. Plywood partitions had been erected at odd angles, and most of the furniture had been removed to make way for shelving painted in bright colors. What's easy? The carpet was in a single color, a rather lurid green. The lampshades were meant to resemble parchment. It all looked smart and fresh, but seemed to lack solidity. You felt that the walls might give way if you leaned on them, and that the paintwork was not quite dry. Above all, especially when James stood up. You felt that the apartment was too small for him, that he was boxed in and had to be careful not to bash into things when he moved around. An open door to the right revealed the bathroom, where there was only just enough space for the bath. The kitchen was no more than a galley, with a spirit stove on a bench. James was sitting in a small chair with a cigarette in his mouth and a book in his hands. Maigret had the distinct impression that there was no contact at all between these two people. They each sat in their own corner, James reading, his wife crocheting, with only the sound of the cars and trams outside the window to break the silence. No hint of intimacy whatsoever. He stood up, offered Maigret his hand, smiling awkwardly, as though he were embarrassed to be seen in such a place. "How are you?" Maigret. But his familiar cordiality had a different ring in this doll's house of an apartment. It seemed to clash with the furnishings, the carpet, the modern ornaments arranged on the shelves, the wallpaper, the fancy lampshades. "I'm fine, thank you. Take a seat. I was just reading an English novel." And his expression was saying, "Don't mind all this. It's none of my doing. I don't feel at home here." His wife listened in, without interrupting her work. "Do we have anything to drink, Mart?" he asked her. "You know we don't." "Huh?" Then, to the inspector, "It's his fault. If we ever get any bottles of liquor in, they get drunk within a couple of days. He has enough to drink when he's out. Inspector, what do you say we go down to the bistro?" But before Maigret could respond, James frowned as he looked at his wife, who must have been making urgent signals to him. "If you'd like to." He closed his book with a sigh and started fidgeting with a paperweight lying on a low table next to him. The room was not more than 4 meters long, and yet it felt like 2 rooms, as if 2 people lived their lives here without ever crossing each other's path. The wife, who had decorated the flat entirely to her own taste, spent her time sewing, embroidering, cooking, making dresses, while James would come home every evening at 8 and eat his dinner without saying a word, then read until bedtime. When that sofa covered with brightly colored cushions was pulled out to form a bed, it was easier now to understand James's need for his little bolt hole on the terrace of the Tavern Royale, with his glass of Pernod in front of him. "Sure, let's go." And James leaped to his feet with a sigh of relief. "Could you wait a moment while I get my shoes?" He was wearing slippers. He squeezed between the bath and the wall. The bathroom door was still open, but his wife didn't bother lowering her voice. "Don't pay any attention. He's not like other people." And she started counting her stitches. 7, 8, 9. "Do you think he knows something about the business at Morsang?" "Where is the shoehorn?" James muttered as he rummaged noisily through a cupboard. She looked at Maigret as if to say, "You see what I mean?" James finally emerged from the bathroom, once more looking too large for the room, and said to his wife, "I'll be back soon." "I've heard that before." He motioned to the inspector to get a move on, no doubt fearing his wife might change her mind. Even in the stairwell, he seemed too big, as if he didn't match the decor. The first building on the left was a bar frequented by taxi drivers. It's the only one around here." The dim lighting glinted off the zinc counter. There were 4 men playing cards at the back of the bar. "Ah, Monsieur James?" "The usual," said the landlord, rising from his seat. He already had a bottle of brandy in his hand. "And what would you like, sir?" "The same." James rested his elbows on the bar and asked, "Did you go to the Tavern Royale?" "I thought so. I couldn't get there today." Because of the 300,000 francs, James's face displayed neither surprise nor embarrassment. What would you have done in my place? Basso is a friend. We've drunk together hundreds of times. Cheers. I'll leave you the bottle, said the landlord. He was obviously used to James and was anxious to get back to his card game. James didn't seem to hear, but continued. Basically, he didn't have a chance. A woman like Maddo. Talking of whom, have you seen her recently? She came by my office earlier to ask if I'd seen Marcel. Can you believe that? It's like that guy with his car. He's supposed to be a friend, but now he rings me to say that he's going to have to ask me to pay for the repairs and the charge for releasing his car from police custody. Your good health. What do you think of my wife? She's nice, isn't she? And James poured himself another glass of brandy. Chapter 7. Night at the Crossroads, where not only roads intersect, but memories, lies, and sins are also interwoven like a spider web. You think everything is in your hands, but Maigret begins to realize that he has opened the wrong door. 1:12 a.m. It was pouring rain, and the headlights of the patrol car were reflecting off the windows of the Anderson living room. Maigret sat alone, holding a cold cup of coffee, staring fixedly at the extinguished fireplace. He did not sleep, not because he did not want to, but because in his head there was a faint sound that only those accustomed to death could hear, the rustling of something hidden under the floor. Else went upstairs. Carl Anderson was locked in the holding cell. The case seemed to slow down, but it was then that Maigret began to see other outlines. A corpse was not the only one. 02:06 a.m. Maigret followed the passageway behind the house, where he had noticed that the floor tiles were uneven, as if they had been deliberately relaid, flashlight in hand. He bent down and removed each tile. A musty smell rose from below. Then another smell, familiar, that Maigret had encountered on the border of Marseille, the smell of decomposing human skin. A small cellar, dark, cramped, and freezing cold. Inside was a heavy sack, stained with dark, dried blood. He opened it. Is a human body. Unlike the previous victim, this one was wearing a security guard uniform. 2 fingers were cut off, and his teeth were broken. But there was one more strange detail. In his pocket, he had an Antwerp customs officer's card, but under his name was a faded stamp of the Danish Ministry of the Interior, the kind only issued to secret agents. 3:25 a.m. Maigret sat up straight, his eyes no longer hazy. It's not just smuggling. It's not just murder. He muttered, this is a war of spies. And Anderson is not the victim. Knock on the door. Else. She was wearing a silk robe, her hair down, holding a glass of hot milk. Long night, Inspector. Her voice did not shake. No surprise. Maigret put the flashlight down on the table, his eyes never leaving her. Do you know who he is? Else did not deny. She put down her glass of milk. He came to bring Carl back. But Carl was no longer the Carl he had been before. What was it before? She smiled, painfully. A man who buried bodies in Copenhagen. A disgraced agent. Replaced. Chased from the shadows. Maigret sat silently. Now he understood. Carl Anderson was not an innocent man, wronged. He was a survivor of a failed campaign, who fled to this land with his sister, the only person who still chose to believe him. And of theirs, like the murdered customs officer, came to silence, purge, and burn the evidence. 04:00 a.m. Maigret turned on the internal radio and called headquarters. Send in the forensic team. I need to get fingerprints from the new body, and give me the diplomatic contact with Copenhagen. Urgent. His voice was as cold as the road at dawn. Upstairs, Else stood in front of the mirror, removing her necklace. Hidden inside was a small rolled-up piece of paper. Chapter 8. The Woman Who Emerges from the Smoke. The crossroads divide not only the cars, but also the living and the dead. Those who follow the law and those who control it from the shadows. And sometimes it is the person who seems to be under investigation who holds the key to the heart of the corrupt network. 06:12 a.m. It was still raining. A thin white mist hung around the Anderson house. Maigret had been awake all night. He stood in the backyard, his eyes glued to the second-floor door where Elsa's room was. The door opened. No one was there. The bed is made. The milk from last night is still there, cold. Elsa's gone. 07:10. The forensic team arrived. Maigret did not wait for them to finish. He went straight to the local train station. No one saw Elsa leave. But the ticket seller remembered. A man came in and bought 2 tickets at dawn, one to Paris, one to Cologne. At the same time, didn't get on either train. A sign of professional reconnaissance. Tracking interference. Else isn't running. She's distracting. So 8:44, Maigret returned to the regional police station. At the door of his office stood a stranger, gray overcoat, silk tie, brown briefcase. Inspector Maigret. Who are you? Levin. State Department. I'm on the Special Liaison Group on Nordic issues. No referral. No summons. But his voice was authoritative. We request that you forward this case file to Paris. Immediately. Maigret understood. He didn't say, request. He said, suggest, a way of speaking of someone who wants him to retreat before the truth becomes too big to handle. Maigret replied, there were 2 bodies. One was an unknown man. One was a government agent. One was a woman who disappeared. And I was the only one who was there from beginning to end. Levin narrowed his eyes. That's why we want you to stop. For everyone's safety. 10:03. Maigret returned to the inn and opened the envelope Else had left in the old book. Inside was no apology, a map of the Danish-German border, with points marked with old military symbols. Some of them coincide with the locations of unsolved disappearances from 2 decades ago, accompanied by a handwritten note. You can't save Carl, but you can stop other Carls from being created. 14:00 p.m. The Paris press has reported the 3-way intersection case was transferred to the interministerial level because it is related to national security. Maigret's name does not appear. No one mentioned Else. That night, Maigret wrote the final report, then put it in the safe. Didn't send it. He stood by the window, looking out at the wet street. The headlights reflected like memories shimmering, then fading, then gone. No one searched for the girl who disappeared. No one asked about the man who died twice, once in Copenhagen, once under the floor. Toy. Chapter 9. Light behind the curtain. You once believed you were the investigator, but then one day, you discovered you were just a pawn in a prepared chessboard, and the real controller never appeared in the minutes. 3 weeks later, Paris. Maigret was summoned to the Ministry of the Interior, not by official letter, but by a brief telegram, personal report. No delay. On the 5th floor of a gray stone building near the Quai des Orfèvres, he met Levin again. The man in the gray overcoat from the day before, this time in a white shirt. Rolled up sleeves, no tie. Sit down, no ceremony, no drinks. There was only a thick file in front of Maigret. You went too far. Maigret did not reply. Levin pushed the file back to him. Inside, pictures of Else in Hamburg, Oslo, then Prague. Different times, different names, but always the same gaze. And one last photo, she is walking out of a suburban house, accompanied by a man whose face is blurry, but whose stance is very familiar. We know you kept the map she gave you. Levin said, we know you have not submitted your report to the ministry. Maigret smiled slightly. You guys know a lot. We must know. Levin leaned back, because we are the ones who rewrite history after every case. Silence for a long time. Then Levin said, without blinking, there are 2 ways this can end. Maigret, one is that you hand over all the documents and retire with honor. The other is that you become the target of an investigation for breach of duty, unauthorized handling of evidence, and, if necessary, collusion with an international fugitive. Maigret looked straight at him. What if I choose the third option? Levin pursed his lips. There is no third way. Maigret stood up. He took the file, without asking permission. Leaving the room, he didn't take the elevator. Walked. 5 floors. Quietly. That night, Maigret sat in his old apartment on the Quai des Orfèvres. The lights were off. The windows were open. A cigarette was burning. On the table was a file. Next to it was the map that Elsie left behind and a handwritten letter. If you are reading this, it means I am not dead, but I am no longer the same person. They want me to be silent. I am mute. But what about you? Will you speak or not? Maigret opened the drawer. Inside was a small tape recorder, the kind he had never used for official transcripts. He pressed the red button. This is an undelivered statement. My name is Georges Maigret. In the case of the 3-way crossing, I investigated not just a body, but a structure of murder and burial and legal documents. If anyone finds this tape, understand, justice is not in the courtroom. It is in the memories of the survivors. Outside, car horns blared softly. Maigret did not turn around, because now he is the one being watched. Chapter 10. A voice among fake names. You were tracking a murderer. Now you're tracking a name. But that name changes 3 times in a month, and each time, someone dies. Berlin, 1 week later, Maigret sat in a cafe next to Friedrichstrasse station. It was snowing lightly. The wet road stained like old blood on interrogation paper. In front of him was an encrypted fax, a photo of Else, now named Alina Markova, a Czech citizen, registered as a resident of a small hotel in Kreuzberg. As the waiter poured more coffee, Maigret asked, "Do you see this girl?" The waiter glanced at the photo, his face stiff. She left this morning, but not alone. There was a man with her, tall, wearing a black fur coat. French, I think. Memories come back like a knife. Carl Anderson, alive, or just a ghost? Maigret can't leave behind. 2043. Maigret arrived at the hotel. The room Else had rented was empty, except for a handkerchief draped loosely over the pillow. neatly folded. Embroidered on the edge, EA, a sign sent back, intentionally, like an invitation to play a more dangerous game. 2 on 22. Maigret called Paris, not through the official line. Lucas, are you listening to me? You are suspended, sir. I didn't ask that. The voice on the other end softened. I'm listening, Maigret whispered. Check the files on recent disappearances in Eastern Europe, especially those linked to Cold War spy programs. I think Else isn't hiding. She's just finishing her old job. 22:04. In the hotel room, Maigret discovered a small listening device behind the light switch, not the kind the police use. Follower is being followed back. The next morning, Maigret tracks down an address Else had given on her declaration, a private library specializing in cryptography, called Die Schattenleser, the Reader of Darkness. The librarian was a blind old man with a hoarse voice who spoke fluent French. She was here before. Read a lot about the DDR underground communication system. And asked about a name. What's your name? Lemuel? Maigret was speechless. Lemuel, the code name of a failed 1973 counterintelligence project where several spies were murdered after their identities were leaked from within. Carl Anderson was a part of that project. Else isn't just running away. She's hunting down the one who betrayed them. End of chapter. The chapter. Maigret sat back in the library, his hands running through dusty files. In the darkness of thousands of cipher characters, he found an unfinished report, dated 1973, location Copenhagen, author signed LM. There is another handwriting in the margin, Georges Maigret. If you are reading this, the game is not over. Chapter 11, The Unconscious Traitor. The further back you go, the less sure you are of who was the killer and who survived. Worse than being fooled is having assisted in death, only to realize years later, when the blood has dried and the name has changed. Copenhagen, gray and cold morning. Maigret stood in the middle of Gammeltorv Square, where he had come nearly 30 years earlier to hold a hearing on transnational drug crimes. He was younger, faster, believed in structure. He couldn't remember people's faces. But now, old faces returned, slowly fitting into the puzzle Elsie left behind. 11:15. Maigret visits the Danish National Security Library, home to encrypted files from the Cold War era. Thanks to an old contact, a man named Jürgen Nisted, who had been an Interpol representative, he was taken into a special reading room. The Lamiel profile is marked closed, no access. English quiet. Maigret slipped through the cracks the old way. His old name and position still carried weight, even though he had been suspended. 12 hovering. The original report was in a gray-blue file. Flipping through it, he saw names he didn't recognize, and one he never expected. Recruitment of foreign intelligence collaborator Georges Maigret at the secret request of the French liaison section. He read slowly, his heart beat slower. A 1973 report describes how he, as a young criminal investigator, was embedded in a network investigating arms smuggling from East Germany. But all the information he gathered turned out to be relayed incorrectly, leading to the identities of 5 Western spies being exposed and murdered. One of them has the code name Lamiel. Else is not simply Carl Anderson's lover. She is the sister of one of the spies who was killed. Carl is the only one left alive, the only one to take the blame for those who have washed their hands clean. Maigret stood up. His hands were shaking, not because of old age, because the past is no longer what you chase. It is what chases you back. 14 Jusust. He left the library, silently throwing away his access card to the secret files. The price of truth was no longer proof. It was pain. The phone rings. Lucas, low voice. Sir, word from the Prague communication station. Else was discovered in an abandoned church, but was gone when the team closed in. All they found was a book and an old photo of you and Carl in Gammeltorf, 1973. Chapter 12. The investigator is being tracked. You investigated death. Now, death is investigating you, not with guns or knives, but with memories, with records, with people who lived long enough to prove you wrong. And the worst part is they're right. Paris, headquarters of the Ministry of the Interior. The file Maigret. Jules is retagged. A new note in red. Subject had access to sea-level classified data. Not notified according to procedure. Possible contact with suspected diplomatic personnel. Suggested undercover surveillance. No direct contact. In an underground office, 3 men sat around a round table. They didn't say it out loud. There was no need. Maigret's report was now evidence he could exploit or silence. He is out of control, but he has opinion. He has history. Then let him slide off the sidelines. No need to kill him. Just discredit him. At the same time, Maigret was in the suburbs of Paris, Auchan, a small rented room, old wooden walls, window overlooking the train station. He no longer had a home, no longer had a position, no longer had an office on the Quai des Orfèvres. There was only an old file and a small notebook, handwritten with each location that Carl Anderson had been to after the Lamiel campaign failed. 2241. A figure stood silently in front of his apartment door. No knock, no sound. Maigret knew he was being watched, but also no surveillance is the action of the uncertain. That is, he is still one step ahead of them. He wrote a handwritten letter. If I disappear, it will not be an accident. It all started in Gammeltorf, 1973. It will end where everyone thought they had forgotten. But Else never forgot. And now, neither do I. He put the letter in an envelope and sent it to Lucas, the last person he trusted. Dawn. He left Paris by night train. He did not use his real name. He took no paper records, just a single cassette tape, the confession transcript in Chapter 9. Destination Brno, former Czechoslovakia, where Carl Anderson once hid under the pseudonym Peter Holin. An abandoned monastery was once a transit point for spies fleeing Berlin. And where else was last seen? In the train, Maigret looked out the window. His shadow was cast against the glass. Older, more tired, but for the first time, not vague. Because now he knows to solve a secret, not to find the culprit, but to look at yourself in the mirror and dare to accept sometimes you are the cause of everything that went wrong. Chapter 13. The Monastery of Records. There are places that do not exist on maps, but remain forever in the memories of those who never return. And when you enter them, you do not just enter a building, but enter the very archive of erased memories, of rewritten people. Brno, 05:17 a.m. Maigret stepped out of the train station. It was raining lightly. There were no taxis. He walked, following the old map that Carl Anderson had marked in pencil. The neighborhood was deserted, as if no one had ever lived there. There were only broken concrete buildings, boarded-up windows, and fallen signs. At the end of the road, among the bare poplars, the Saint-Mathieu monastery appears, ruined, but still standing. 07 Georges. The monastery door creaked as it was pushed open. Inside was dark and cold. It smelled of burned paint, mold, and old ash. Below the chapel, he found a small room. Walls covered with donkey skin. Wooden table. Chairs covered with torn leather. In the corner of the room was a metal box. The lock was gone. Maigret opened it. Inside is, it shows a tape marked La Meal, The Last Night. Black and white photo of Carl Anderson, sitting with his head down on a table, his hands tied. A faintly typed list titled Tentative Record/Cancel, November 73rd. The last name on the list, J. Maigret, Reserve, retained for observations. 0732. Maigret was silent. He had not only contributed to the disaster, he was once chosen to be recorded. Recording, in their way, is to erase memory, to reorient memory, to turn a person into an unconscious tool. At that time, he was kept. For stability, no doubt. For innocence. It's not that you're gone. It's that you're not worth deleting. Not yet. So ate sorer. Footsteps, not mice, not wind. Maigret turned off the flashlight, pulled out his gun. A figure walked in. Light shined softly through the hatch. Elsa. She didn't say hello. She just put a stack of files on the table, then sat down, breathed evenly, didn't shake. I'm still following. Right. Not for me, for the truth, and for your brother. The files are transcripts, agent lists, and transit station maps. Carl tried to bring these to light, but he failed because someone warned them. Else didn't answer. She just looked at him. You were one of them, weren't you? Maigret nodded slightly. No denial, but no apology either. 8:27. Else pushed a piece of paper over to him. It was a list of people still alive in the old network. Below, someone is running the new system from Paris in an official capacity. Maigret looked at the name, eyes closed. 11. End of chapter. Two people sat across from each other in the cellar. On the table is evidence that no one dares to touch. Outside the door is the wind whistling through the broken wall. And in Maigret's heart, there was no longer anger, but responsibility. If I didn't know, I no longer have the right to remain silent. Chapter 14. A truth also needs new evidence. Injustice is not always found in court. It is hidden in the files that are never opened, in meetings that are never recorded, in names that are redacted. But there is one thing. Injustice always fears someone who lives long enough to tell the story and has the evidence. Paris. 1 week later, Maigret and Else sat in a small cafe near the Gare de l'Est, where no one would come to follow him, thinking he had disappeared. They carried a suitcase. No money, no passports, just files, tapes, and a list of the real names of those who had rewritten history. The plan does not begin with taking the file to the police, because they don't trust the police. They believe in free media, and journalists have nothing to lose. One name, Else mentioned Juliette Serrault, a former investigative reporter who was ostracized for exposing shady disappearances in the diplomatic community. 15. Acer. Juliet appears in an old printing house where she runs a semi-underground newsletter called La Dernière Voix, The Last Voice. Maigret handed her the tape, a transcript of his confession. Else hands over the dossier, detailing the agents killed, the cover-up process, and documents directly linking Levin to the cover-ups. Juliet did not ask, "Are you sure?" She just said, "If I die, I will die with this story in print." 27. The first paper was published using the old method, offset printing, hand distribution, sending encrypted PDF over independent networks. Title: The Truth About Lamiel and the Role of Those Who Wear Clean Robe. 3 days later, the first reaction did not come from the Interior Ministry, but from the public online. Fake accounts began attacking Juliet, calling her a reactionary. But a video excerpt of Maigret's confession, posted anonymously, has gone viral. I am Jules Maigret, and I was kept not because I was right, but because I was not dangerous enough for them. Now, I want to be dangerous. 1 week later, Levin held a press conference, denying everything, calling Maigret a tired, paranoid legend in his old age. Soon after, a secret audio recording was leaked. Levin's voice talking to a former Eastern European official, confirming the reallocation of the Lamiel file. The public turned, but the government did not respond, because silence is the way to keep power. Chapter 15. Invitation to Silence. You used to crave the truth, but now that the truth is out there, the first thing they do is not apologize. They invite you into a room, make you some tea, and ask, "Can we settle this peacefully?" Paris, Ministry of the Interior, secure basement. No press, no cameras, no formal summons. Maigret was invited by an official without a name tag, without introduction. Just a man in a white shirt, a gray tie, a monotone voice. They sat across from each other. On the table was a printed agreement and commit to stop disseminating information, withdraw testimony, and not continue to publish documents related to the Lamiel case. In return, Maigret will rehabilitate it in state press. Quote, to be authorized to provide special advice to the ministry on intersectoral issues, and forgotten. You will lose nothing. You will be remembered as the image France wants to preserve. All you have to do is sign. Maigret was silent, not because he hesitated, but because he was remembering Elsa, image of a girl sitting in a ruined monastery, holding a list of people to be erased. She didn't need him to be a hero. She just needed him to not be silent like everyone else. Maigret took the agreement. Read from beginning to end. Underline each line carefully, as if reviewing an arrest warrant. Then tear it in half. I don't need special counseling. I don't need to be remembered. I just want them, the people who were called accidents, to be known by their real names. The officer smiled slightly. Not surprised. I thought you would say that. And you know what that means. Maigret stood up. I am old enough to be afraid no more, and young enough to continue telling stories. On the way back, he called Juliet. Prepare for the next part. They will attack us by all means, but if we stop now, then we will be the ones to kill again. Chapter 16. Live Bell. Not all bells ring in churches. There are bells ringing from screens, from microphones, from hearts, when the truth finally finds its teller, and fear is no longer strong enough to stop them from speaking. Paris, 20 users. Independent broadcaster Voix Publique. The room was just big enough for 3 people, a camera, and a few microphones. No advertising, no sponsors. Just the quiet urgency of people in the know. This is the only, and possibly the last, time they get to say it all. Maigret sat in the middle. On his right was Juliette Serrault, thin, her eyes as sharp as a scalpel. On his left was Elsa Anderson, silent, but as solid as a wall. 20. So 1. The broadcast begins. No intro. No background graphics. Only Maigret, looking straight into the camera. I am Jules Maigret. I served in the French police for nearly 40 years, and I'm here not as an investigator, but as a witness to a buried truth. He said about Carl Anderson, the man framed to cover up the failed campaign, about the Lamel network, where spies are used as pawns, about himself, who once contributed without knowing, and then knew but remained silent. Else continued, they said my brother was a traitor. They wouldn't let me keep the body. They wouldn't give me my real name. But they forgot one thing. I'm still alive. And I don't forget. Juliette projects the documents onto the desktop. List of agents executed. 11 recording deals with Eastern European officials. Fake reports were released to distract the press. 20th, 42. The whole country fell silent. The hashtag #Lamiel truth trended nationwide. People began gathering in front of the Ministry of the Interior, holding up pictures of Carl Anderson, with the words, I'm no longer an excuse. 21. Hazre. Counterattack begins. On state television. The announcer read the news. Some individuals are spreading unverified information, causing public disorder. The government will investigate the false propaganda activities. 21:30. Juliette's phone rang off the hook. Her personal accounts were locked. Her email was hacked. A fake indictment appeared online accusing her of unlawful access to government systems. Maigret received an anonymous message. The person you want to protect has cooperated. The records don't lie. Else read, her face did not change color. I don't need them to be clean. I just need them to be real.